Ian Watkins had it all. Adoring fans due to the success of his band Lostprophets, millions of pounds in the bank, and offers to play some of the biggest festivals around the world. However, Watkins was in fact two people. One, the talented musician, the other, one of the most depraved paedophiles the UK has ever seen, who used his fame to abuse his fans and gain access to children. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Ian Watkins was born on the 30th of July 1977 in Wales and met his future Lostprophets bandmate Mike Lewis whilst they were still at school. Their love of music led to them forming their first band as teenagers, who used to play in Watkins' garage. After being in a number of bands, in 1997 Watkins, Lewis and several other musicians formed the rock band Lostprophets, who made their live debut in 1997. The band initially only saw limited success in the South Wales scene, playing gigs at venues across Wales, including Newport. It was the release of their debut album The Fake Sound of Progress in 2000, which brought them to wider attention, and from there the band's fan base exploded, leading to Lostprophets playing support for bands such as Linkin Park and Deftones, as well as headlining gigs of their own. Over the next 12 years, the band released 4 more records, sold 3.5 million albums worldwide, and played some of the biggest festivals in the world, including Glastonbury. They earned particular success in the UK with the songs Last Train Home and Rooftops. This next clip shows Watkins talking about the band's comeback after a hiatus in 2012.
Kind of weird because to us, we've never been away from ourselves. Americans forget that there are other countries out there. There's a whole world outside of America, you know. The last record didn't come out in America, but, you know, went platinum in the UK and we did, you know, tours, just toured it constantly, and it was like, and then on this new record, this is our first record on a major label in the UK, because all the other ones have been on in indie. It's kind of weird. It's not that, like, we'd forgotten or given up on America, because like 4 of the guys live in LA, you know what I mean, and married American girl, so they're like, we gotta tour America, and I'm like, well, you know, yeah, cool, but if not, you know what I mean, like, I love playing America, but I'm not gonna lose sleep over it, you know what I mean, it's kind of, but then...
However, there would be no comeback. By the point of this interview, Watkins was mere weeks away from being arrested for horrific crimes he had committed, including the sexual abuse of babies. What's even worse is that the police had known about these crimes for years and had had numerous opportunities to stop him. Concerns related to Watkins were reported as early as 2008, 4 years before his arrest. In December of that year, a former partner of Watkins called social services and said that he'd given their infant child cocaine and touched him inappropriately. This information was passed to South Wales Police, but was not acted upon. By this point, Watkins had already taken advantage of underage fans, including the previous year in 2007, when he'd abused a teenage girl who was a virgin. Watkins got her to dress as schoolgirl's outfit and videoed them having sex, orally, vaginally and anally. He asked her whether she enjoyed being his, quote, underage slut. He also urinated on her face and told her to drink it. In March 2010, information was passed to South Wales Police that Watkins was involved in child pornography and that he had stated that he wished to engage in sexual acts with children. In June 2010, information was again sent to South Wales Police claiming that Watkins was in possession of child pornography and had claimed to have molested a 4-year-old, and he was using social media platforms to groom underage boys and girls. Just 2 months later, in August 2010, South Wales Police received yet another report about Watkins, this time stating he forced young girls from the age of 14 to have sex with him after gigs and recorded the acts on his laptop. Watkins also claimed to have gone on social media, threatening the children that he abused, telling them that he'd get people to come round and, quote, sort them out if they told anyone. Watkins repeatedly boasted and bragged about his behaviour and how he wanted to escalate his offending. It's clear that he thought he was untouchable. In May 2011, this woman, Joanne Majlix, a former partner of Watkins, made a complaint about police inaction surrounding his behaviour. This clip shows part of an interview with her, where she describes her interactions with Watkins.
He began telling me about all the underage fans that he took the virginity of, and he was proud of it, and how he abused them, and how his favourite video that he had was of a 14-year-old schoolgirl stripping off and saying her name and date of birth to the camera just before he took her virginity, and just all the other vile things that he said he'd done to these fans. And that, I would say to him, stop talking, I don't want to hear it, just stop talking, it's upsetting me. He started saying that he wanted to get me pregnant just so that he could rape our daughter.
In February 2012, a man made a report to South Wales Police stating his daughter might have been molested by Watkins, who had filmed the assault. There were more reports, including in April 2012, when an Australian national contacted South Wales Police and said that Watkins had boasted about getting a 13-year-old high and having sex with her, and that he hoped she fell pregnant. Watkins also boasts about drugging other young girls to have sex with, and his hopes that they too would get pregnant. In June 2012, South Wales Police were contacted by another individual who stated that Watkins had, quote, an unnatural interest in children, and that he had texted her saying he wanted to drug and rape a baby. So South Wales Police were contacted by multiple people separately, all of whom basically made the same accusations about Watkins, that he was an unrepentant paedophile, and they did nothing. We'll return to this later. However, there was one report which gave an indication of the depravity of Watkins, and which brings up the worst offences he committed. In March 2012, South Yorkshire Police were contacted by a woman, known only as B to this day, who said that she believed that Watkins had sexually assaulted her 10-month-old son at a hotel in Cardiff. She also said there were rumours that Watkins had raped a 5-year-old. However, despite this report, B would end up in the court with Watkins, and her abusive trust of her son is nothing short of sickening. Court records state that B met Watkins in late 2011 when she was 19 years old. She was a fan of the Lostprophets and was soon in communication with Watkins. B was a mother with a newborn baby, and her contacts with Watkins including them discussing him raping this child. B and Watkins met in a hotel in Cardiff in March 2012 after the pair discussed abusing the child, with B texting Watkins, quote, tell me if you want to get your dick in our boy. They had also both discussed drugging the child. Whether B called police because she was having second thoughts is uncertain, but what is clear is that just a month later, she was fully under Watkins' spell and would do whatever he wanted. Between the 2nd of April and the 3rd of April 2012, B and Watkins stayed in a hotel in London, and she, quote, presented her 10-month-old son to be raped by Watkins. He penetrated this child's mouth with his penis and tried to anally rape him. These acts were filmed, with B heard encouraging Watkins. Then, again whilst being filmed, B sexually abused her own son, including sucking his penis. On the 2nd of August 2012, Watkins sent B a message saying, quote, to be honest though, I think we have gone easy on him so far. Time to teach him and make him learn to love it. There was a second meeting at a hotel in Wales in September 2012, and after this meeting, B sent a picture to Watkins of her licking her son's penis. Anonymity has been given to both mother and child in this case, but obviously that child is still out there, and, inevitably, one day will have questions about their mother. God knows what they'll be told, and how finding out the truth would destroy their entire life. Also in the dock with Watkins was P, another mother who utterly betrayed the trust of her child, this time a baby girl. P was in her early 20s when she began communicating with Watkins in August 2012. Not long afterwards, the pair spoke about abusing her baby girl and moving in together. One of the text message exchanges went as follows. Watkins stated, quote, if you belong to me, so does your baby. P replied stating, quote, understandable, a mother-daughter slave duo worshipping you. Watkins said, quote, that's all she will know, a life of filth. The contact continued and involved conversations about P and her baby daughter performing oral sex on Watkins and their plan to drug this little girl and force her to have sex with animals. Watkins did not get his hands on this girl, but he watched via webcam whilst P penetrated her daughter's vagina with her finger, and she also sent in pictures of her genitals. None of the calls to the police led to any action, and eventually Watkins' downfall was due to his arrest in September 2012, following the execution of a drugs warrant. This resulted in computers, mobile phones and storage devices being seized, resulting in his sexual offending being exposed. In order to break the code on his laptop, South Wales Police had to employ the services of GCHQ, the UK's Communication Intelligence Agency. On screen is the password that unbelievably was found to be on Watkins' laptop. Watkins appeared in Cardiff Magistrates Court in December 2012, along with B and P, who had been identified and arrested due to the content of his computer. Watkins' barrister indicated that he would plead innocent to all offences. All three were remanded into custody. However, likely realising there was no way he could explain the material on his computer, mobile phones, etc., on the 26th of November 2013, Watkins pleaded guilty to 13 offences, including attempted rape and sexual assault of a child under 13, 3 counts of sexual assault involving children, 6 counts of taking, making or possessing indecent images of children, and 1 count of possessing an extreme pornographic image involving a sex act on an animal. Both B and P pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting their children, as well as facilitating Watkins abusing them. Sentence was set for the 18th of December 2013. During the sentencing hearing, the depravity and remorselessness of Watkins was laid bare. Not only the seriousness of the offences, but his behaviour since being remanded into custody. Specifically, a few days before his sentence, Watkins was recorded on a prison phone call saying, quote, "I do my charm, or do I end up making things worse for myself? Or do I just say I was off my head and can't remember?" He also said that he was going to release a statement saying that his abuse of children was, quote, "mega lols," whilst also stating, quote, "I don't know what everyone is getting so freaked out about." During the hearing, and showing the coward that he is, Watkins, through his barrister, claimed he could indeed not remember his sexual abuse against the children of B and P. None of this was accepted by the judge. Reference was made to a probation pre-sentence report where the author outlined their conversation with Watkins, who described wishing to push ever more extreme sexual boundaries. They assessed him as a dangerous sexual offender and wrote, quote, "It's also my assessment that the child victims in this case appear to be coincidental to his need to dominate and to test out the extent to which his sexual partners would collude and participate in his sexual interests." A police investigator said that Watkins was probably the most dangerous sex offender he had ever seen. Justice John Royce stated that the offences collectively, quote, "plumbed new depths of depravity." He also stated, in reference to Watkins, quote, "I'm satisfied that you are a deeply corrupting influence. You are highly manipulative. You are a sexual predator. You are dangerous. The public, and in particular young females and children, need protection from you." Turning to woman P and woman B, Justice Royce outlined their unspeakable actions and identified that both had utterly abused the trust placed in them as mothers. He then sentenced them. Ian Watkins was sentenced to 35 years in prison. He has to serve at least 19 years before he can apply for parole. Woman P was sentenced to 17 years in prison, to serve half in prison prior to release and the other half to be spent in the community monitored by probation. Woman B was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Again, half of this is served in prison, half in the community being monitored. By my calculation, both B and P will have been released by now. Watkins likely has another 9 years to serve before he can even apply for release. As the expression goes, how the mighty have fallen, Watkins went from a life of luxury to a 60-foot square cell at H&P Prison, Wakefield, a Category A prison in Wakefield, West Yorkshire, dubbed the, quote, "monster mansion," due due to the high number of highly dangerous sex offenders who reside at the establishment. However, finally being caught for his crimes and time behind bars appears to have had little impact on Watkins, and he remains a highly dangerous sex offender. In 2017, it was reported that Watkins had been corresponding with a 21-year-old fan in which he joked about her toddler watching her have sex. Whether Watkins still considers his offences mega lols is unclear. What is apparent is that he is where he should be, and the fame that he used to groom and abuse others will inevitably come back to haunt him, as it will be this fame, and now infamy, which will mean that when he is eventually released, he will not have a moment's peace when the papers track his location and report his movements, likely for the rest of his life. As already stated, there were numerous chances to catch Watkins years before his eventual arrest, and this led to an investigation by the Independent Police Complaints Commission, the IPCC, who published a report in the summer of 2016. Within this, they said that 3 detectives from the South Wales force should face disciplinary action after they failed to act on earlier allegations. The report concluded, quote, "The consequence of the force's failings was arguably that a predatory paedophile offended over an extended period of time. The evidence obtained in this investigation suggests that South Wales police were faced with a litany of reports about his behaviour, yet in some instances did not carry out even rudimentary investigation, made errors and omissions, and missed opportunities to bring him to justice earlier than he ultimately was." South Wales police accepted the findings of the report and expressed regret for the handling of the Watkins case. However, I can see that one detective was cleared of misconduct, and I cannot find any information about action being taken against the other 2, so it would seem that nothing actually happened as a result of the police's failings in this case. I have no doubt that Watkins' brazen behaviour and his remorselessness before and after his conviction is because he bought into this idea that as a celebrity, he was untouchable and the rules of normal people did not apply. Unfortunately, this seems to be a common problem. In the UK, the name of Jimmy Savile will go down in infamy as one of the most depraved sex offenders the country has ever seen, but also because he was never convicted in his lifetime, despite everyone knowing what he was. I'm struggling to believe that if Watkins had just been a random guy, that South Wales police would not have arrested him in 2 seconds flat. So, do you think that part of the issue in this case was Watkins being given a pass because he was a celebrity? Why is it that we give celebrities so much leniency and somehow place them above us? Or was it just police incompetence? Or both? Do you think Ian Watkins is one of the most dangerous paedophiles you've heard of? In December 1998, 21-year-old Lindsay Quay went missing from her home in Stamford Road, Southport, in Merseyside, UK, leaving behind her 2 children and her 23-year-old husband, Mitchell Quay. Quay, like any concerned husband, appealed to the press for help finding his wife, but his demeanour was off-putting and highly suspicious, but he took it a step further, basically inviting the press into his life. Here is an example of one of these interviews.
I haven't done anything to Lindsay. I'm not capable of doing something like that. Like I say, I'm not going to sit here and start saying yes and no to stupid things, stupid questions I've already answered 1,000 times.
And just say again, and it's not a stupid question, it's a very serious question. Did you kill Lindsay?
Wait and find out.
By the point of this interview, Mitchell Quay had strangled Lindsay to death, dismembered her, and scattered her remains in separate areas of Southport. This man is a manipulative, remorseless monster. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Lindsay Quay, formerly Lindsay Wilson, was born in 1977. The youngest of 6 children, she was described as beautiful, fun-loving, happy, and a caring person by those who knew her. When she was 17 years old, she became pregnant with her first serious boyfriend, but 5 months into the pregnancy, they separated. Soon after this, she met Mitchell Quay, a casino worker who promised to help her raise the child, and the pair soon became inseparable. They married quickly, within 5 weeks of beginning their relationship. This was a warning flag which we'll return to later. In 1995, Lindsay gave birth to her first child, a daughter called Robin, and in 1997, the couple had their first child together, a son called Jack. Outwardly, everything seemed ideal. Lindsay was a young mother with 2 beautiful children. However, behind the scenes, in her short life, Lindsay was subjected to persistent violence and emotional abuse at the hands of her husband, a controlling, narcissistic coward who believed that he was smarter than everyone else. Heartbreakingly, after her death, a diary that Lindsay had written in since 1997 was uncovered, and this showed the depths of her despair and how unhappy she was. She dedicated this book to her children, and whilst we will never know, the content of the pages appears to indicate that she was leaving it for them, because she feared that her own life would soon come to an end. In the diary, she wrote, quote, "This book is for my kids, to let them know how hard my life was and how I tried my best to bring them up on my own, and let them know how much I love them." She also wrote, quote, "I hope you never have to go through anything that I had to go through. All I can say is, I've done my best. I hope it was good. One thing I've always done since the day you were born is make sure you knew I loved you. To my 2 babies." I've read reports which indicate repeated acts of violence within the family home. A neighbour recalled one occasion when Lindsay was 4 months pregnant with Jack, running down the road to get away from Kwai, who had assaulted her and then proceeded to smash up the property. It's clear that Kwai, as with other domestic abuse perpetrators, was a coward, a man who felt the need to achieve and maintain control over his wife. These individuals almost always have deep-seated fears of abandonment, and they feel that fear is the only way they can ensure their partner will not leave them, something they're unable to cope with. Between January 1998 and April 1998, Kwai left the family home on at least 7 occasions. On the last occasion, apparently for good. This led Lindsay to write in her diary, quote, "Mitch walked out, then came back." And on another occasion, she said, quote, "Gone, moved out again." Lastly, she wrote, quote, "So this time he's gone for good. Have had it with him." Rather than leaving it to the end, I wish to explain why Kwai was acting in this way and give some context. One of an abuser's tools is withdrawing affection, where they withhold attention and caring in order to elicit a negative emotional response. A good example is ignoring their partner's phone calls or refusing to talk to them at home, etc. This is intended to make the victim feel worthless and agitated that, at any point, they could be abandoned, so they will often walk on eggshells, not wishing to displease their partner in case they leave them. This includes the perpetrator leaving the family home when they'll inevitably go to another property and sit there imagining how upset their partner must be. However, this is all a facade. These people are often emotionally dependent on the relationship and simply want the attention and the negative response. They want to see how devastated their victim is by their actions. They want them begging for them to come home because this makes them feel powerful and dominant in the relationship. Of course, as with all domestic abuse perpetrators, it's one rule for them and one rule for the victim. Of course, they feel they should be allowed to simply come and go from the relationship as they please, but if the victim tries to leave at any point, then God help them. Unfortunately, this was the case with Lindsay. In the summer of 1998, Lindsay was apparently free of Kwai and found a new home for herself and the children in Stamford Road. She managed to obtain this with the help of Women's Aid, an organisation that helps victims of domestic abuse. Lindsay was so afraid of Kwai and what he might do to her that she was given a public protection alarm which she could activate and the police would descend on the property. However, soon after moving into her new home, Kwai started worming his way back in. Remember, this was never actually about leaving the relationship. He wanted her to see how important he was to her by withdrawing his affection. However, I think he saw that Lindsay was doing things on her own, moving on with her life, and he couldn't allow this, and he needed to be back in order to control her. Kwai was living with his wife and the 2 children in December 1998. On December the 15th, 1998, Lindsay was seen alive for the last time. She then disappeared. Despite Lindsay going missing in December 1998, her loving husband did not report her missing straight away. In fact, he'd never reported her missing at all. It was only in February 1999, over 50 days since her disappearance, that a concerned social worker for the children raised the alarm, due to not having seen Lindsay for some time. When the police eventually spoke to Kwai, he had no explanation as to why he'd never reported his wife missing, with him claiming that he just assumed that she'd up and left one day. Whilst Lindsay may have left him, the police struggled to believe that she would have left her 2 children without a word before Christmas. Lindsay's family also could not believe it, and they knew Kwai was lying. They had no doubt that Kwai had hurt Lindsay, but it was a case of proving it. However, Kwai, being the narcissist that he is, couldn't simply put his head down and get on with his life. Instead, he craved the media's attention. He went on morning television to make an appeal for his wife, and even invited journalists and a documentary film crew to follow him around. Everyone who came into contact with Kwai was suspicious. He seemed to show no negative emotions when talking about the disappearance of his wife, the mother of his children, and instead seemed jovial, without a care in the world, with him later being dubbed the, quote, smiling killer. Kwai obviously thought he was very clever, but the police knew almost immediately that he was the killer. Remember, the police had information which was not available to the public, including calls to 999 about the various reports of domestic violence that Lindsay had been subjected to. They'd also spoken to her friends and family, all of whom pointed the finger directly at Kwai. In early February 1999, Kwai made a claim that he'd seen Lindsay locally in the market and in a BMW being driven along. The police checked and found no evidence of this. However, what they did uncover was that since his wife's disappearance, Kwai had been forging her signature in a benefits book so he could withdraw her money. On February the 27th, 1999, he was arrested on suspicion of murder and fraud. The police didn't have enough evidence to charge Kwai with murder, but charged him with fraud, and he was convicted and given community service. I think the police were trying to psychologically intimidate Kwai, showing him they knew he had done it and were not going away, and it was only a matter of time. A terrible part of this story is Lindsay's family having to continue to interact with Kwai on a regular basis because of the grandchildren. For 18 months, Lindsay's parents, including her father Peter Wilson, who made his feelings about Kwai clear, had to knock on the door of the man they knew killed their daughter at the home where she'd likely been murdered in order to collect the grandchildren. Kwai claimed that when the truth was revealed and he was exonerated, that Peter would owe him an apology. Kwai was reveling in the attention he was getting and using any opportunity to spin his web of lies, trying to portray himself as the victim, the concerned husband who had been abandoned by his wife, who was being persecuted by society. However, the attention always had to be on Kwai's terms, and after a year of being in the spotlight, Kwai was apparently sick of all the attention, and so gave an interview, which was published in the papers, stating he no longer wanted the attention of the press. So, you have a man being followed around by a documentary film crew who's so sick of the media attention that he had to go to the papers to tell them to stop publishing stories about him. Clearly, the opposite is true. I believe that, after 12 months, Kwai was not getting the attention he was craving, and so had to reignite attention by claiming that he didn't want any further press coverage. I'm sure he was hoping that, by saying, "Don't look at me," people would be more fascinated and feel compelled to pay him more attention. Kwai's particular nemesis in the police was Detective Superintendent Jeff Sloan, who stated, quote, "He almost goaded me by going to the media. I just felt he was an egotist in exploiting the situation. He started to revel in his own notoriety." Kwai would antagonize the police, including sending DS Sloan a Christmas card with a bottle of hair dye with a note stating he should, quote, "get rid of the grey bits to have more confidence." We're all human beings, and if someone pisses us off, we naturally will expel more energy to try and bring that person down if we know they're ultimately in the wrong. Antagonizing a senior police officer who knows your secret and who has the whole weight of the police force behind them is not a smart move. This shows the complete delusion and narcissism of Mitchell Kwai, believing he was so clever that he could stick 2 fingers up at the authorities and they would not come after him. He was wrong. The walls were closing in on Kwai, and this clip appears to be his last interview before his downfall, where again, he is the victim, and he wishes the viewer to see that front and centre. The police have been working on this case for 18 months, convinced that Lindsay was dead. And, although they didn't have a body, they were able to show there'd been no activity on her bank accounts, she had not kept any other appointments, and no one, aside from her husband, had apparently seen her since December 1998. In addition to this, they had records of his apparent violent behaviour towards her, and statements from her friends and family that outlined the same. They also had nothing from their inquiries which would give any indication that Lindsay would have ever left her children. In addition, the police found out that, on the day she was last seen alive, the 15th of December 1998, Lindsay had spoken to friends about meeting with a solicitor to finally divorce her husband. There was likely more information the police had, but I cannot find specific reference to it. I do know that they searched the family home, so potentially they found forensic evidence. Regardless, on the 7th of June 2000, 18 months after Lindsay went missing, Mitchell Quire was arrested on suspicion of murder. He gave no information during interview, but this didn't matter. The circumstantial case was enough to charge him with the murder of his wife Lindsay. However, being charged seemed to open the floodgates, and Mitchell Quire confessed to killing his wife. Based on his confession and evidence collected by the police, they were able to determine what had become of Lindsay Quire. Specifically, it appears that in the early hours of December 16, 1998, Lindsay informed Quire that she was leaving him. They had an argument, and Quire grabbed Lindsay round the neck and strangled her to death on the living room floor. This was while both children were in the house, lightly asleep in their beds. Afterwards, Quire placed Lindsay's body in their bedroom and closed the door, placing towels at the foot of the door to stop the smell of decomposition. How long Lindsay remained in the bedroom is unclear, but it's apparent that Quire carried on as if everything was normal, taking the children to school, feeding them, and playing with them in the house where their mother was lying dead. However, Quire knew that he needed to dispose of Lindsay and employed the help of his brother, Elliot Quire, aged 22 years old at the time, and who was employed as a butcher. Within the bathroom, the Quire brothers cut up Lindsay's body, removing her arms and legs, as well as her head and hands. Her body parts were then deposited around various sites in Southport, with her torso being dumped near a roller coaster at Southport Pleasureland. Her arms and legs were found dumped in a bush near a railway line. Her head and hands were disposed of in a landfill, but unfortunately were never recovered by the police. On June the 9th, 2000, Quire agreed to show the police where Lindsay's remains had been deposited, as shown by this clip, which demonstrates his lack of remorse for his actions and a lack of concern for his wife, and his continued need for attention. On the 16th of January 2001, Mitchell Quire appeared for sentence at Liverpool Crown Court before Justice Brian Leveson QC, having pled guilty to the murder of Lindsay Quire. This was clearly a calculated move by Quire, as he'd agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter, i.e. admitting that he killed Lindsay, but claiming that it was an accident. However, this was rejected. I've no doubt his guilty plea was to get some credit from the court for his sentencing. Justice Leveson described Quire as, quote, an evil cynic, and stated, quote, you killed your wife as long ago as December the 16th, 1998, in circumstances which I accept were not premeditated. What followed, however, was very different. Over the next 18 months, you embarked on a deception of breathtaking cynicism, appearing on the television and radio, bemoaning your wife's absence and castigating police for directing their attention towards you. He then sentenced him. Mitchell Quire was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 17 years for the murder of his wife Lindsay. His brother Elliot Quire was sentenced to 7 years for dismembering and helping to dispose of Lindsay's remains. Mitchell Quire appeared to show no remorse for his behaviour whilst he was in prison and was still obsessed with himself. Psychiatric nurse Chris Keneally worked at the same prison as Quire and stated that he was, quote, one of the most unpleasant psychopaths he'd ever met. Chris stated that Quire would become excited when his image appeared on television and would ask staff whether they'd seen his various appearances. Chris said, quote, he seemed very disappointed. He expected that everyone in the prison would now recognise his star status, and he also expected to be treated as the celebrity that he felt he was. He was very upset that this did not happen. Kwai first became eligible for parole in 2017, and this was denied. Lindsay's daughter Robin released a statement after this decision, which read, quote, "It makes me feel a lot safer knowing he won't be getting out, and it's a little bit of justice for my mum, although nothing that ever happens will be enough justice. There's not much more to say, other than we are happy we can relax for a while and not constantly have it at the back of our minds." Kwai again applied for parole in May 2022, but this was again refused by the parole board, who had ongoing concerns about his risk and him taking drugs in prison. The decision letter from the parole board stated, "Some concerns have also emerged about his conduct in relationships with friends, professional staff and other prisoners. Reports gave examples of instances where he'd acted on grievances and been aggressive towards others. There were also some concerns about his involvement with drugs in the prison. Professional staff have identified the need for further interventions to address Mr. Kwai's risk in relationships and the risk of violence if he became preoccupied with a specific problem, struggled to deal with it, and still lacked the capacity to be in full control of his emotions." So, Mitchell Kwai, now aged in his mid-40s, remains in prison, having served 22 years so far. The knockback from the parole board in 2022 means he's likely to have another hearing in 2024. The outcome of this hearing will inevitably be publicised, but it seems that the parole board still have significant concerns about this man and its risk of violence, so he's likely years from release. I keep returning to the issue of domestic abuse, and I make no apology for this, as it's insidious and one of the worst types of offences I've come across, given how underreported it is, its persistence, the profound psychological and emotional impact it has on its victims, but also the often fatal consequences of this type of behaviour. As I've said in a previous video, 2 women a week in the UK are murdered, either by a partner or a former partner. This is over 100 a year. In the US, this number is around 70 a month, so approximately 840 women a year, which is a staggering number. This is not to forget men who are killed by their female partners, but the opposite dynamic is obviously more common. During each of these videos on domestic abuse perpetrators, I hope to give a little more insight and understanding to their behaviours, warning signs, and also give advice. With regards to the template I've spoken about before, domestic abuse perpetrators almost always have significant issues with abandonment and self-esteem, with them feeling that, because of how they perceive themselves, they will inevitably be abandoned, something they cannot cope with, and so they seek to control their partner to ensure that this does not happen. This includes physical and non-physical actions, which are used to gain and maintain control over their victim. A common exhibited behaviour is violence, with this being used to put the victim in fear if they defy the perpetrator's authority, demonstrating to them who is in charge, making them feel powerful. However, there are also emotional and psychological methods, and this includes, as already stated in the case of Mitchell Kwai, withdrawing affection, which can include ignoring the victim, threatening to leave them, or actually leaving them. This is intended to cause the victim emotional distress by making them feel abandoned, and therefore, when this affection is given, it's usually with certain conditions, with the victim having to act in a certain way. This, though, is just a pantomime. The perpetrator relies on the relationship, and everything they do is to make sure they are not abandoned. There is an horrific hypocrisy in the behaviour of domestic abuse perpetrators. They feel they can act in any manner they want, but if their victim does anything they don't like, even something they themselves have done, they will be punished. In the case of Kwai, even though he'd repeatedly left the family home and abandoned Lindsay and the children, when she dared to try and divorce him, he would not accept this, and I've no doubt he killed her as a way to exert ultimate control over her by taking her life, ensuring that she would not leave him and be with anyone else. Domestic abuse perpetrators tend to consider their victims as objects, which they can use any way they want. This is not to say they don't care about them on some level, but their needs and wants take priority. However, Mitchell Kwai is not one of these people. He's clearly a man who saw Lindsay as nothing more than his possession, with him referring to her body as a, quote, carcass. In addition, his demeanour through all the interviews is not that of a grieving husband. He's smiling and joking. He has no empathy or concern for what he's done, including the fact that he's robbed 2 children of a mother. Mitchell Quire is clearly a predator. I think this was shown initially in the relationship with Lindsay, which brings us to our first learning point. Specifically, domestic abuse perpetrators will often form relationships with people who they believe are vulnerable in some way, and therefore more easy to manipulate and control. With Lindsay, she was very young, aged only 17, 5 months pregnant, and her partner had just broken up with her. I believe that Quire saw an opportunity and swooped in like a knight in shining armour, apparently saving Lindsay from having to go through raising a child on her own. They got married in 5 weeks, and this is a massive warning sign. Domestic abuse perpetrators will often progress relationships extremely quickly in order to make it more difficult for their victim to leave, and also to place themselves in a position where they can more easily control them. This can include moving in with a partner quickly, getting them pregnant quickly, as well as getting engaged or married soon after the relationship has started. All of these tactics, in the perpetrator's mind, strengthens the link between the pair, with them believing that if they're living together, or a man and wife, or have children together, their abuse is more likely to be tolerated, and a victim will not be able to extricate themselves quickly from the situation. Unfortunately, it is all too common for perpetrators to use these same things to maintain control and punish their victim if the relationship does come to an end, including using child contact to monitor their former partner and potentially turning the children against their mother. Mitchell Quire's complete lack of regard for anyone but himself is not only shown by the murder, but his behaviour afterwards. It's clear that he filled the deep, dark hole of insecurity inside of him by using the media to get himself attention. There was no concern about being caught, but instead it was about manipulating others to give him sympathy. Poor little Mitchell. Your wife has gone missing, but of course you are the real victim. The fact that this need for attention extended to him wanting the media to see him, whilst he was directing the police to his wife's remains, in my opinion, is indicative of his underlying psychopathy, with him having no conscience, no remorse. It's clear that Mitchell Quire wanted attention whatever way he could, whether this was as the innocent persecuted victim or the vicious cold-blooded killer. It was all the same to him. Perhaps this cold lack of any sort of conscience is what the parole board detected and which is stopping him from being released. However, regardless, the end of this video should not be about Mitchell Quire. It should be about the beautiful young woman whose life he cruelly snatched away, and the 2 children who had to grow up without their mother. It's also about Lindsay's family, who had to wait so long for justice for their daughter, and, given the condition of her body, were not able to say goodbye properly. In a heartbreaking postscript, Lindsay's brother, Peter Wilson, committed suicide soon after Quire's imprisonment in 2001. He was just 24 years old. The coroner's inquest showed that he'd taken his life because he struggled to come to terms with the death of his sister and was unable to process his grief. I hope both he and Lindsay are at peace, and that the family, including her children, have been able to move on from the horror inflicted on them. Just after midnight on Friday, March the 13th, 2009, a 999 call was received reporting a man had collapsed at a property at 14 Arthur Street in the town of Chiltern in County Durham in the UK. When paramedics attended, they found 35-year-old Andrew Gardner, a vulnerable man due to underlying cognitive issues, dead in the living room. The paramedics were told that Andrew had been assaulted in a bar fight, had come home and collapsed, but the police were quickly called. But it was noted that Andrew was malnourished and his body was covered with new and old injuries. Andrew had been the victim of domestic abuse for years, and his last few weeks alive had been a living nightmare, during which time he'd been tortured, including being burned, starved, beaten, as well as having noughts and crosses carved into his body, using him as some sort of human game board. 3 people were responsible: 24-year-old Simon Nichols, 44-year-old Stephen Martin, and the ringleader, 28-year-old Claire Nichols, a sadistic, psychopathic manipulator who not only inflicted horrific injuries on Andrew, but did this in front of her young children, and sickeningly, even encouraged them to participate. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Andrew Gardner was born in around 1974 in the town of Gateshead in Tyne and Wear in northeast England to Ken and Jean Gardner. He had significant learning disabilities, which were diagnosed when he was a child. Andrew had a close relationship with his two brothers and his parents, and they were a very tight family. There's no indication that Andrew was ever subject to or experienced violence or abuse in the home. In fact, his childhood was very loving. However, in school, he was the subject of bullying, with his peers taking advantage of him due to his naivety and kind nature. But, despite his own experiences of abuse, Andrew was described as a loving, polite and quiet young man who was never violent and who would try to diffuse situations if he could. He had a kind heart, but unfortunately was always a target of those looking to exploit him. In 2005, at the age of 31, Andrew met 23-year-old Claire Nichols, a single mother with 3 children, who had a history of violence towards intimate partners and an evidenced history of sadistic behaviour. Unfortunately, this meeting would end in Andrew's death just 4 years later. Claire Nichols was born in around 1982 and was raised in Portsmouth in Hampshire. Given that 2 of the perpetrators in this case have the same surname, I'll refer to her by her first name moving forward. In contrast to the happy environment that Andrew grew up in, Claire was raised in a dysfunctional home, repeatedly witnessed domestic abuse between her parents, who eventually split up. Claire left the family home when she was 15 years old, and 3 years later, in around the year 2000, she began a relationship with a man called John Peterson. Whilst Claire was only 18, Peterson was 42 years old and had previously served in the Royal Navy. Peterson would later testify on calls about Claire, calling her a, quote, she-devil, and saying, quote, she beat and battered me all the years I was with her, 4 or 5 times a week. She was horrible, a control freak who would flip all the time. She'd throw her shoes, punch me, have a go, and verbally abuse me for the least thing. If I went to the shops without her, she'd attack me. If I went to do the gardening, she'd do the same. I still have nightmares. However, this is where the story begins to get complicated, as it's important to point out that John Peterson was a convicted paedophile. Claire was fully aware of this, and not only stayed with him, but the pair had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. Social services became involved, and basically told Claire that she either needed to leave Peterson or lose the children. Rather than safeguarding her own children and doing what social services stated, she fled north, moving away to Newcastle, but taking Peterson with her. The pair finally separated in 2003, and Peterson only saw Claire after this when she broke into his property with her new partner, Stephen Martin. Again, the story gets a bit complicated when it's pointed out that Martin had been the long-term partner of Claire's mother for around 7 years before they got together. So he basically moved from mother to daughter. The relationship between Claire and Steve Martin was on and off for around 6 years, with the pair regularly having sex, even if both were in relationships. Later, at court, Martin was found to have an IQ of 59, putting him in the lowest 1% of the population in terms of intelligence. It does appear that he was physically abused by Claire, but his main role was to cater to every command. If Claire needed something, she would snap her fingers and he would come running. In 2005, during an apparent break in her relationship with Martin, Claire Nichols met Andrew Gardner. Apparently it had occurred when he was signing up for a learning disability course at the job centre. I want to break here to point out a few things. 3 things specifically. Firstly, it's clear that Claire was a violent, controlling monster in relationships, likely replicated the behaviour she herself had seen as a child. Secondly, is her complete disregard for the welfare of anyone but herself. She allowed her children to be around a sex offender, knowing full well about John Peterson's history. I don't know what previous offences Peterson committed, but in October 2021, he was jailed for 10 years for a historic sex offence where he raped a 5-year-old girl. So he was a dangerous predator who posed a risk to female children, yet Claire had children with him and allowed them, including 2 girls, to be around him. And instead of taking the advice of social services, ran off, taking her children and the paedophile with her. Clearly no one else mattered but Claire. She did not care what her children were exposed to. I was willing to place them at risk. Which brings me on to the 3rd point, the reason why she did this. I think that she stayed with Peterson because he was someone she felt she could easily control. He was a paedophile, likely vilified by everyone who knew him, and likely alone. Someone, she believed, if he reported anything, would not be believed, or potentially others would think he deserved it. She had leverage over him. If he displeased her, she could very easily disclose his offending to anyone she wanted, making his life hell. This fits within a pattern of targeting and beginning relationships with men who were vulnerable or had some other issue which she believed she could exploit. With Steve Martin, he had an extremely low IQ and was basically her lapdog. And then she met Andrew Gardner, who, as I said, she apparently met when he was signing up for a course where people learn disabilities at the job centre. I can't help but draw the conclusion that Claire approached him and saw him as someone she could control and begin a relationship with for that purpose. Unfortunately, Andrew had no idea about Claire's background and walked into the spider's web. Soon after the relationship began, Andrew and Claire moved in together, and he became a surrogate father for her 3 children. Also living in the property was Claire's younger brother Simon, who was later around 19 or 20 years old when the relationship began in 2005. Simon was again a man of low intelligence, just the sort of person that Claire felt she could dominate, and therefore was useful to her. Within the family home, Claire was a monster, fully in charge. She would exert control any way she wanted and punish any dissent swiftly and forcefully. With her brother Simon, she would beat him if he didn't do household tasks to her satisfaction. However, the main abuse was reserved for Andrew. He was frequently beaten, and this carried on when Claire became pregnant with his child in around 2007. Andrew would be punched repeatedly if he tried to get anything to eat, with him needing to ask permission to eat the food in his own home. He was often starving, as Claire would sometimes forbid him from eating any meals for days, and he had to resort to taking food when she wasn't looking. She would then accuse him of, quote, stealing. Again, this is the food in his own home, and then he would be beaten. Claire went as far as ripping the pockets out of Andrew's trousers, so he could not conceal food from her. The last time that Ken and Jean Gardner, Andrew's parents, physically saw their son was in 2006, when he turned up at their door, looking malnourished and distressed. He was no longer the happy man they remembered. He'd been beaten down, and his spirit was broken. Despite trying to contact him over the years, they had no luck, and this was all due to Claire. She forbid Andrew from contacting his parents. In around 2008, Claire gave birth to a daughter. Andrew's first child, her 4th, and he was forbidden from taking this child to see his parents. In fact, it was not until after his death that Ken or Jean even knew they were grandparents. In July 2008, Claire, her brother Simon, Andrew, and the 4 children moved into 14 Arthur Street in the town of Chiltern. It's here that Andrew would suffer a horrifying death less than a year later. Andrew was basically a prisoner in 14 Arthur Street. He was prohibited by Claire from leaving the house without permission, and it got to the point where the neighbours had no idea that Andrew was living in the property, as they rarely even saw him. Also, his parents didn't even know where he was living. Both Claire and Simon would beat Andrew, with Simon acting on the directions of his sister. Andrew was becoming increasingly emaciated, and he was starved for days, being beaten if he dared to take food from the house in order to keep himself alive. He was also forced to sit, watching the family eat a meal while he got nothing. Claire would also verbally abuse Andrew, telling him he was useless and a drain on the household. For some reason, in about February 2009, Claire told Steve Martin to move into the property, meaning that there were 8 people in this small house. After this point, the level of torture endured by Andrew escalated significantly, and his final months were nothing short of a nightmare. The 3 of them took turns in torturing Andrew, with Claire coming up with various ideas about how to inflict as much pain on him as possible. Andrew had boiling hot water poured over him and was burnt on his body, especially his neck, with a cigarette lighter. He was forbidden from sleeping in a bed or sitting on a sofa. Instead, he was forced to sit and sleep on piles of newspaper, which would be used to soak up the blood from his injuries. Also, Claire would have said to Martin, right in front of Andrew, in order to cause him as much distress as possible. This catalogue of abuse is shocking enough, but it gets worse. It needs to be pointed out that the 4 children in the property were witness to all of this, And, in an absolute sign of complete depravity, Claire directed her children, including the daughter she had with Andrew, to participate. These children were only 5, 7, and 9 years old. In court, Claire's 7-year-old son would state, quote, "My ma'am got him and stamped on him. She does that because he's stealing food. He thieved a chocolate bar once. We hit him as well. I scratched him with keys and also hit him with my fists. We wrote swear words on his back. We do that in pen and nail varnish." All 4 children were encouraged to abuse Andrew, and this included cussing him with a knife. After his death, Andrew was found to have noughts and crosses carved into his body, which the children had done under the direction, which the children had done under the direction of their mother. Andrew was also whipped with wet tea towels, and his injuries later showed that he'd been cut with knives, including receiving a cut to his leg so deep that it exposed his tendons. Andrew was beaten mercilessly by all 3 adults in the home. At the beginning of March 2009, Claire started jumping up and down on Andrew with all of her might, causing severe fractures to his ribs. She would also jump up and then land on him with her knees. This caused severe internal injuries, and Andrew spent his last few days in agony. For approximately a week prior to his death, Andrew was unable to walk and was likely slipping in and out of consciousness in excruciating pain. It's believed that he was merely propped up against the wall, and it would have been clear he was dying, but no one came to help Andrew. Also remember that all 4 children would have seen this, including Andrew's daughter. Sometime in the late evening of the 12th of March 2009, Andrew suffered one final attack, when Simon and Martin held him down and Claire again jumped on his ribs, as well as kneeing him in this area, with enough force to cause further rib fractures. She also kicked his already burnt feet, fracturing one of them. So sometime during or immediately after this attack, his body gave out and Andrew Gardner died. Paramedics who attended the scene on the 13th of March 2009 did not believe a word of what was said to them. Andrew had clearly suffered injuries over weeks and had not died due to some fight. The police reached the same conclusion, and Claire Nichols, her brother Simon, and Steve Martin were all arrested on suspicion of murder. The autopsy of Andrew Gardner took 7 hours due to the sheer number of injuries that needed to be documented. Andrew's body was found to have over 150 separate injuries, including numerous fractures, with 21 of these being to his ribs from where he had been stamped on. There was also bleeding on the brain from repeated head injuries. There were also injuries from where Andrew had been slashed with knives, whipped, and burned both with hot water and cigarette lighters. He also had bruises and scars all over his body, as well as blood poisoning. Despite being 35 years old at the time of his death and 5'9", Andrew weighed just 120 pounds, or around 9 stone at the time of his passing. This was due to him having been starved for months. Andrew's injuries were so horrific that they were determined to have been akin to someone who had suffered a traumatic fall from a height or a serious car crash. Andrew's death was determined to have been primarily due to crushing chest injuries, which caused significant trauma to his organs, including his lungs and heart, as well as internal bleeding. Andrew essentially suffocated and bled to death. His final days would have been characterized by excruciating pain. All 3 suspects were interviewed, and both Simon Nichols and Steve Martin broke quickly, trying to save their own skins by pointing the finger at Claire. Simon and Martin both admitted they had physically abused Andrew, but they said that Claire was the ringleader and they were only following her directions, and they were both afraid of defying her due to her violent temper. Claire simply denied everything, claiming that in the hours prior to the 999 call being made, Andrew had been out and apparently been mugged. He then staggered home and collapsed. 30 minutes later, an ambulance was called according to her. However, it was clear that Andrew had been dead for hours by the time help was called. The evidence against the 3 was overwhelming, and they were all charged with the murder of Andrew and remanded into prison to await their day in court. On the 4th of January 2010, Claire Nichols, her brother Simon, and Steve Martin went on trial for murder at Teesside Crown Court, having pleaded not guilty to these charges. Simon and Martin essentially continued to dig themselves nice big holes, amidst his acts of violence against Andrew, but pointed to Claire as the main instigator, and that they only did these things because they were afraid of her. They seemed to misunderstand that they were essentially admitting to their role in Andrew's death and just implicating Claire rather than actually proving their innocence. During the course of the trial, it's established that, whilst they may have been afraid of Claire, they made choices to become involved. In the case of Steve Martin, he'd been living away from the property and had moved into Arthur Street of his own volition. Claire twisted and turned during the course of the trial. She was initially determined to throw her brother and Martin under the bus, then reverse back over them. She continued to try and exert control over them, including shouting out that they were liars when they were giving evidence implicating her. Realising the writing was on the wall, Claire tried to claim that she had assaulted Andrew, but that his death was accidental, and therefore she was guilty only of manslaughter. This was rejected by the court. When she took the stand, Claire was ripped apart, making statements which were obviously bullshit and made no sense. On the stand, the prosecutor stated, quote, "Miss Nichols, you caused him that excruciating pain because you jumped on him with your knee, a technique you used." She responded by saying, quote, "I admit to jumping on him once. The rest of his broken ribs would have been caused by my brother Simon. I did not realise that my knee going into his ribs was going to cause him so much pain. So she kneed him in the ribs with enough force to break them, but didn't realise this would cause him pain." Absolute bollocks. On the stand, Claire showed herself to be a psychopath, a woman without remorse. Her crocodile tears were a facade, trying to gain sympathy from the jury and avoid taking any responsibility for the torture and murder of an innocent and vulnerable man. The jury saw through her lies, and all three were convicted of murder. On the 22nd of January 2010, Claire and Simon Nichols stood to be sentenced before Judge Peter Fox. His sentencing remarks noted that the death of Andrew Gardner was an act of sadism. He stated that Claire was a controlling, manipulative, callous and calculating woman who has a, quote, "deeply entrenched personality disorder." He said that she had set a, quote, "dreadful example for her children by exposing them to such serious acts of violence and encouraging them to assist in torturing Andrew. With regards to Simon, Judge Fox said that he had acted, quote, "knowing full well what your sister was doing to this man. You repeatedly were the enforcer, stepping in cruelly when he sought to resist or avoid her attacks." Judge Fox reinforced the findings of the pathologist that Andrew Gardner died in agony due to the extensive injuries he had suffered from weeks of torture. He concluded by stating, quote, "In the weeks prior to his demise on Friday, March the 13th last year, he was cruelly tortured and subjected to an appalling catalogue of attacks, which not only caused him acute pain in so many ways at your hands, but also dreadful humiliation. In your sometimes different, but sometimes joint ways, you each contributed not only to the breaking of his body, but also his spirit. In his final days, that he must have spent prone or leaning against a wall, he was deprived of all human dignity." He then sentenced them. For the murder of Andrew Gardner, Claire Nichols was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 32 years before she can apply for parole. Simon Nichols was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years. Stephen Martin's sentence was delayed for various reports to be written, and on the 13th of February 2010, he too was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 20 years before he could apply for parole. All three subsequently appealed the length of their sentences, but all were rejected. This case just has layers of horror. This is again highlighted by how Ken and Jean Gardner found out about their son's death. They saw news about a man being found dead at a property in Chiltern, but had no idea that this was their son. As they did not know where he was living at the time, Claire made sure he was totally cut off from them, but then had to go through the horror of receiving a knock at the door and being told their son was not only dead, but had been the victim of domestic abuse for years, and his last few weeks on Earth had been marked by horrific acts of torture. A victim impact statement read out in court written by Jean stated, quote, "To be told that Andrew was dead was horrible. I knew there was something wrong straight away. He was someone who would simply walk away from trouble. To listen to the details of how he died and the suffering he went through was beyond belief. The thoughts of what went on at the hands and direction of that evil woman has left me with nightmares that will probably never go away. Andrew was a pleasant, caring, loving lad who kept out of trouble and was never violent to anyone. It hurt being here. It hurt watching her give evidence, so much so I had to go out of the courtroom. I knew she was lying. It's unspeakable what she and the others did. You don't do that to another human being. They've turned our family's lives upside down and left us empty shells. I called them evil to their faces in court, but it hurt even more to see their smug reaction. No matter how long they're behind bars, the hurt they cause will never go away. It will be with me and my family forever. To highlight the man that Andrew was, in contrast to the monsters who robbed him of his life, it's assumed the reason why Andrew stayed in the property was for one reason, and for one reason only: the daughter he had with Claire. He was described as a, quote, doting father to his daughter. He loved her and wanted to be with her and was not a man to abandon his responsibilities. His family believe, and I think this is true, that Andrew was unwilling to abandon his daughter, to leave her in the care of a woman as evil as Claire, and so he stayed, with him hoping, probably, that he could protect her from her sadistic mother. Unfortunately, this would cost him his life. It upsets me when people make comments saying, why did they not just leave, or why did they not see the red flags? I realise now I shouldn't be annoyed or upset. People don't necessarily understand domestic abuse and how insidious it is. Leaving is not that easy. Do you not think that someone whose whole purpose is to control their partner has not worked to cut every avenue of escape? When people say, why did she not leave him, or why did he not leave her, this suggests this person is the one making choices in a relationship, and this is missing the whole point. They've often been robbed of this choice, often because they're scared of what might happen to them, which is a well-founded concern, as in the UK, 2 women a week are murdered by their partners or former partners. So please, think what you write. Domestic abuse is much more complicated than you probably realise. I think this is important to point out because of Andrew. He was clearly isolated, alone with no money, and basically confined to the house. He had no means of escape. And this should be the focus. The fact that this poor man spent his final weeks being abused and tortured, and that he died alone, with this being the only escape from the horror he endured. I hope he's at peace. While 3 people were convicted of Andrew's murder, it's clear that Claire Nichols was the ringleader, so my focus will be on her. This woman is truly evil, a psychopathic sadist who clearly has no remorse or empathy or interest in anyone but herself. It's clear she's a woman who saw people in her life as a means to an end, things to be manipulated, used and abused. I don't have enough information about Claire's past to identify when or how she became this type of monster. But, like other people I've covered, like Catherine Knight, I think she despised men, saw them as beneath her, and therefore she was able to justify treating them in any way she wanted. She was also an utter coward, targeting the most vulnerable men she could find to do her bidding and to control, knowing that these individuals likely had significant difficulties in understanding the danger they were in and potentially did not have the ability to reach out for help or formulate a plan to escape. I have a particular disdain of people who target the vulnerable, for reasons that I'll probably get into at some point in the future. But basically, adults who I've met with learning disabilities have often been some of the purest, least pretentious people I've ever met. They're some of the most caring and kindest people. They see the world in such a different way, a way I would like to see it. It's a place of happiness and hope. So when these people are targeted, I feel truly sickened, as they often have no defense against the predators of this world, and their pure spirit and their personality, which more people should have, is destroyed. Andrew Garden was someone like this. Everything I've read about him says that he was a lovely man, someone who's honest, caring, trustworthy, and devoted to those he loved. He loved his daughter, and stayed and suffered the abuse, likely so that he could be near her and try to protect her. He wanted to bring happiness into the world, and he was targeted, abused, and murdered by a woman so weak that she needed to manipulate and control vulnerable men in her life in order to feel a sense of control. The part of this case which really, really gets to me, and which I think shows the utter depravity of Claire Nichols, is the issue of her children. As I already said earlier, she allowed them to be around a convicted paedophile, showing no regard for the potential harm this person could have caused them. But, worse still, she exposed them to horrific acts of violence towards Andrew and even got them to be involved in his behaviour. None of these children were over the age of 10 years old, but her poisonous parenting meant that she made them believe that torturing someone was okay. However, I don't think she thought about this too much. She didn't give a shit about the lifelong trauma these children would have to deal with. Her only focus was on getting others to do her bidding. Also, Claire would have known as part of the trial prep that her 7-year-old son was going to be forced to testify, not only having to relive the horror that he'd seen in his home, but also having to admit that he had been involved in the abuse of Andrew. This would have no doubt re-traumatised his child, but Claire did not care. She was willing to throw anyone under the bus to save her own skin. As I've said repeatedly in my videos, the one constant is the link between childhood experiences and future criminal behaviour. In the case of Claire, all she taught her children was that violence and manipulation was acceptable, that people who you claim to love are allowed to be hurt, tortured, or even killed. I know it will never happen, but I really believe there should be some accountability for parents if their children go on to do horrific things and there is a link to what they're exposed to in the family home. Basically, if one of Claire's children becomes a domestic abuse perpetrator, etc., then I think she should be held accountable as well. I have no information about where her children ended up, but I pray they were taken away from the family altogether and placed with loving people who could try and undo some of the damage their demon of a mother caused. Not that Claire would ever admit any fault. She's a pathetic creature who, in my opinion, and this may be a little strong, should never have been a mother and who should spend the rest of her life behind bars for the horrific torture and murder of Andrew. I'm not sure someone who does something like this and whose personality is so clearly sadistic and psychopathic can ever truly be considered to not be a risk to society. However, the question of whether she will be released or not is not something that will be addressed until approximately 2042, when she's able to apply for parole, when she's around the age of 60 years old. On the 15th of July 1992, 23-year-old Rachel Nickel was walking with her 2-year-old son in Wimbledon Common in London. She was then attacked in a frenzy, being stabbed almost 50 times and sexually assaulted, with her 2-year-old being found trying to wake his mother up. It's a crime that shocked the nation, and Rachel's face is one of the most recognised victim photographs in recent UK criminal history. The police completely botched the investigation, putting all their resources into forcing a confession from a completely innocent man, Colin Stagg, who was vilified in the press. Instead, the real killer, Robert Napper, an extremely disturbed and dangerous man, as well as a serial rapist, was free to walk the streets. This was the second time he'd avoided being caught, with a mistake by the police failing to link him to a rape he confessed to a family member almost 3 years before Rachel's murder. However, Napper's reign of terror would continue, and in 1993, he committed a truly horrific crime, murdering 27-year-old Samantha Pizzette before raping and murdering her daughter, who was just 4. He then mutilated Samantha's body, taking at least one piece with him. The details of his crimes are almost beyond belief. Robert Clive Napper was born on the 25th of February 1966 in London and grew up in Plumstead, an area in the southeast of the city. Napper's childhood was horrific. It began with him being exposed to frequent violence between his father Brian and his mother Pauline. Also witnessing this abuse was Napper's younger brothers and their sister. Brian would eventually leave the family home, abandoning the family when Napper was around 9 years old. Napper showed signs of mental illness at an early age. He's documented that his mother, Pauline, became increasingly concerned about her son's behaviour. He would often be explosively aggressive for no reason, going from calm one minute to launching into a frenzy of violence towards his brothers the next. He would also spy on his sister when she was undressing or taking a shower. Pauline later recalled an occasion where she woke up in the middle of the night to find that her bed covers had been pulled back and Napper was stood by the side of the bed, watching her, whilst not saying a word, with a blank expression on his face. He would also begin eavesdropping on conversations between his family members, and especially when they were on the phone. He would then accuse them of making up stories about him. Napper was also extremely dishonest, and is said to have been a pathological liar. Napper and his siblings were taken into foster care when he was around 10 years old. I'm unsure why this occurred, but I imagine it had something to do with the abuse in the home, which was likely far worse than I briefly summarised, but I have no further information. Napper was assessed by the Mental Health Service, and found to have been much more greatly affected than his siblings by the abuse. And, whilst all 4 children had psychiatric treatment, this was more intensive and and went on for longer for Napa. Napa was isolated and lonely in school, and children avoided him because of his odd behaviour and strange mannerisms, and it got to the point where he was, quote, despised. One of his former classmates later stated, quote, "No one wanted to sit next to him in class. He didn't have any friends. He was teased a lot about his spots. In a game of football once, when he headed the ball, the game stopped because no other boy would go near the ball after it touched his forehead." Napa's already concerning personality and demeanour became even worse when he himself was the victim of a sickening sexual attack. This happened when he was 12 years old on a family holiday, with him being raped by a male family friend. This man was later sent to prison for this attack. After this, Napa turned in on himself. He became introverted, obsessively tidy and reclusive. His concerning behaviour towards his siblings increased in frequency. Napa left school aged 16 with some qualifications, but drifted from job to job. He was a man who didn't like to work and struggled to hold down a position. He mainly undertook manual labour jobs, including working in a warehouse. He continued to live in the family home until he was 21 years old, when he moved into his own bedsit. His first brush with the law came in August 1986, when Napa was 19 years old, and he was given a conditional discharge and a small fine for having an air rifle in public. However, whilst this was a minor offence, in secret, Napa was stockpiling weapons, including guns, ammunition and knives. Some of his cache of weapons he would bury in local parks and then return to later. He was also planning sex attacks against women and went on extensive reconnaissance to the local area, making detailed notes in an A to Z and a notepad about locations of areas he could hide, isolated paths, surveillance spots, places he could hide weapons, as well as routes to and from potential rape sites. Napa chose an area known as the Green Chain Walk as his hunting ground. The Green Chain Walk is a string of leafy pathways linking large parts of southeast London, including Plumstead, where Napa lived. Robert Napa is believed to have attempted to rape at least 2 teenagers around this area in 1987, and one of the first rapes he almost certainly committed occurred in October 1989, when he disclosed to his mother Pauline that he'd raped a woman somewhere around Plumstead Common. His mother immediately called the police, but because no cases matched the details of the offence that was reported exactly, they did not investigate further. It looks as though they looked specifically for offences that occurred on the common. What they didn't look at was offences that occurred on the edge of the common. If they had, they would have seen a recent report about a man having broken into a house which backed onto the common and raping a 30-year-old woman in front of her 2-year-old son. Between 1991 and 1994, Robert Napa committed between 70 and 100 sexual offences against women and children, and, until he was identified, he was known as the Green Chain Rapist. Napa's attacks were characterised by extreme violence. They were blitz attacks, where he would appear from nowhere and use surprise and sheer force to overpower his victims and subject them to horrifying sexual attacks. In March 1992, he attacked a 17-year-old girl and tried to rape her at knife point, but he was disturbed and ran off. Another victim, later identified as C, was attacked on the 24th of May 1992. On this date, she was 22 years old and was walking to a barbecue along the Green Chain Walk in Eltham, southeast London, whilst pushing her 2-year-old daughter in her buggy. Suddenly, she became aware of someone following her and then approaching her at speed. Napa had been hiding, waiting in the undergrowth. Napa grabbed C with force and placed a ligature around her neck, pulling her to the ground. She was then stripped, raped and beaten savagely around the head. She later described being thrown around like a rag doll and begging the man not to kill her. As quickly as he appeared, Napa left the scene. The savagery of the rapes committed by Robert Napa was escalating quickly, and while C was lucky to escape with her life, less than 2 months later, he would commit a horrific murder which would shock the nation. Rachel Jane Nickel was born on the 23rd of November 1968, and in July 1992, she was a 23-year-old mother to 2-year-old Alex. She was living with her partner and the father of Alex, Andre Hanscom, in Wimbledon, southeast London. But around 10:20 a.m. on the 15th of July 1992, Rachel was walking her dog Molly through Wimbledon Common whilst carrying Alex. They were in an area which was partly concealed, but still only 200 yards away from other people and dog walkers. From nowhere, Robert Napa emerged and knocked Alex to the floor before attacking Rachel. Napa then began a frenzied attack, stabbing Rachel at least 49 times, including inflicting wounds to her chest, back and neck, with these last wounds being delivered with such force that Rachel was almost decapitated. He also slit her throat. Napa then pulled down Rachel's jeans and underwear and sexually assaulted her. The pathologist later stated it appeared that a finger or other object was inserted into her anus. Her bra had been removed to expose her nipples, and there were knife marks in her t-shirt and bra. The attack lasted literally minutes before Napa fled the scene. As if the crime itself was not horrific enough, Alex thought his mum was just asleep and apparently used pieces of paper which had fallen from her pockets to try and mop up the blood on her face. Soon after the attack, a passerby found Alex next to the mutilated body of his mother, repeating over and over again, quote, "Wake up, mummy." I'm going to play a clip of Alex talking about the murder of his mother as an adult in 2017. I do want to highlight, as an aside, the disgusting behaviour of the press when he and his father were visiting the place where his mother was murdered.
I remember everything, waking up, waving goodbye to my father as he drove off in his motorbike to go to work. I remember, walking hand in hand with my mother along Wimbledon Common, with Molly running around close to us, yes. And then as we ventured deeper into the trees, there was a section that was covered by trees. So all of a sudden, we both sensed that there was something in the air. So we both turned our heads to the right quickly, and all of a sudden we saw this man lunging forward with a black bag over his shoulder. And then, everything just happened. In a matter of seconds, I was grabbed, thrown to the floor, my face dragged across the mud, and seconds later, my mother collapsed next to me. And then I saw him disappear as I was lifting myself up from the floor still, because it all happened so quickly. Then he just disappeared into the distance, like it was a ghost, disappearing. And I stood over my mother and I said, "Mommy, please get up." So she didn't move. So I was thinking, why doesn't she move? Why doesn't she respond? And then I said it again, "Mommy, please get up." And then it hit me, right at that moment. I understood, I made that connection that she was gone and she was never coming back. So my heart was completely broken, You feel that very physically in your heart.
So what kind of person was your mother?
For me, more than anything that she, anything that we might have done together, what she looked like, what she smelled like, any of these things, is the feeling of being loved and of loving in return. That's something that will always be with me. And regardless of me losing her under these circumstances at such a young age, I've always felt so privileged compared to so many others who have never had that experience of being loved and of loving in return.
How did your father explain your mother's death to you?
So the fact that I was there, I'd already understood it all in my mind. There wasn't much for my father to say. But even so, when he came to collect me at the hospital, as he had me in his arms, he said, "Your mother is gone and she's never coming back. But we're going to continue on together,
One of the most intense moments when you went to the Common,
Right.
supposedly privately,
Yes.
with your father. And by this stage, the press were after you.
Yes. All the reporters that were on the other side of the fence realized who we were. So they all came jumping over the fence. My father had to cover my face with a baseball cap and tried to run off as we were jostled, from both sides, and the detectives tried to stop them from coming. And when we actually reached the spot, they put me on the ground, and we left the rose on the spot. And for several minutes, I stood watching my father as he was crying, filled with tears. Meanwhile, my eyes were dry, and I was just standing there, observing him.
Why do you think the press was so desperate to get to you?
The archetype of a young child with his mother, and him being there while his mother was attacked and witnessing all of that. I think there were so many elements that people identified themselves with that, everyone was moved by the story. So the story blew up so much that, the press is a business. We like to think that the press is some kind of news service, but the press is a private-run business with their own agenda, so that was what served them as far as selling newspapers.
The murder of Rachel McKell was horrific. The young mother, attacked in a public park, slaughtered in front of her young son. The Metropolitan Police were under a huge amount of pressure to catch the murderer, with the press and the public demanding results. Understandably. The police questioned 32 men quickly, and they turned to a criminal profiler for help. This man was Dr. Paul Britton. He was a highly respected psychologist who worked with the police on various high-profile cases, including the crimes of Fred and Rose West. He was asked to come up with a profile of the murder of Rachel McKell, and deduced that the man, quote, would be a sexually repressed loner who lived on his own close to the scene of the crime. He'd be in his 20s or 30s with an interest in the occult and in knives. Quickly, the focus turned to a man called Colin Stagg, who was 29 years old and lived a short distance from the common, where he would come most days to walk his dog. He was in the park at the time when Rachel McKell was murdered. Colin was unemployed, a loner, and appeared to have significant social difficulties. He also identified himself as a pagan. Police received information that Colin had corresponded with the woman through a Lonely Heart ad, in which he'd shared graphic sexual fantasies. One person apparently also said that Colin was the man in the e-fit the police had produced of someone seen running away from the scene. Colin was somewhat odd, but he wasn't known to the police. However, they became convinced that he was their man, and they spent considerable resources and employed underhanded tactics to get him to confess. Dr. Britton was consulted, and he suggested that if a woman were to befriend Colin and feign interest in violent sexual fantasies, he might end up admitting to the murder of Rachel McKell. To be clear, there was no actual physical evidence tying Colin to the murder. So, the police launched Operation Esdal with the specific focus of getting Colin Stagg to confess to the murder. This involved an undercover female police officer using the alias Lizzie James befriending Colin in the way that Dr. Britton suggested. Lizzie spent 5 months communicating with Colin via letter, phone calls, and in person, but he didn't disclose anything. Dr. Britton indicated that she needed to express her sexual interest in violence in order for him to reciprocate. So Lizzie told Colin about the best sex she'd ever had, being when she was engaged in a satanic ritual where a human sacrifice had been made. Rather than being turned on by this, Colin was disgusted. Lizzie covertly recorded a conversation between her and Colin, in which she told him about her love of hurting people. Colin was heard to say, quote, "Please explain, as I live a quiet life. If I've disappointed you, please don't dump me. Nothing like this has happened to me before." Lizzie went on and said, quote, "If only you had done the Wimbledon Common murder, if only you had killed her, it would all be all right." And Colin responded, quote, "I'm terribly sorry, but I haven't." Despite absolutely no evidence of his guilt, Dr. Britton apparently told the police that the correspondence with Colin confirmed to him that he was indeed the killer, and he was arrested on August the 17th, 1993, and charged with Rachel's murder. He was then remanded into prison to wait his day in court. After spending 13 months behind bars, Colin Stagg appeared at the Old Bailey for trial in September 1994. The trial collapsed almost immediately when it became clear there was no evidence against Colin, and the police had basically manipulated a lonely man who had made no real admissions of anything. The judge said the tactics of the police were, quote, "deceptive conduct of the grossest kind." Colin was released, but he was vilified in the press. Everyone was convinced that because he got to the stage of being tried, he was guilty, his life was ruined. Just to put the boot in, the police later announced that they weren't looking for anyone else in connection with Rachel's murder. So basically they were saying, yeah, we may have fucked up, but he is the murderer. The lead detective in the case, Keith Pedder, even went so far as to go on television until the early 2000s, reaffirming the fact that he was convinced Colin Stagg was guilty, with him saying in one of these interviews, with regards to the case being thrown out, quote, "I do not believe the system served anybody that particular day." It was not until Robert Napper was finally revealed as the killer in 2008, 15 years after his ordeal began, that Colin Stagg was vindicated by the courts and the press, but his life by this point had been destroyed. In 2008, he was given £706,000 in compensation by the state in damages for the way he'd been treated. That's a lot of money, but does it really make up for so many years of vilification? However, the mistakes made by Colin Stagg were not the only errors which left Robert Napper at liberty to stalk and rape women and commit a truly horrific double murder before finally being caught. August 1992, so the month after he murdered Rachel Nickell, one of Napper's neighbours called the police and said that he believed that Robert Napper looked like a photo fit of the green chain rapist the police had circulated. Detectives went to Napper's house, questioned him, and asked him to come and give a blood sample at the police station. He didn't turn up. Nothing was done about this. A month later, a separate person called the police and said exactly the same thing. The police again told Robert Napper to come to the police station so they could take a blood sample and obtain his DNA. He again failed to turn up. However, the police decided not to pursue this further, as they believed that Robert Napper was not the rapist. Why? Because of the description of the rapist's height. The rapist was described as being around 5'7", and the police eliminated anyone over the height of 6 foot from their suspect list. Napper was 6'2". So a few things. Firstly, I don't know about you, but I can barely judge height. I couldn't tell you to the nearest inch how tall someone is, so relying on this particular detail seems crazy to me. Also, no one seems to take into account that Robert Napper walked with a stoop, so generally looked shorter than he would if he stood up straight. Police then received another phone call, and this one they actually acted on. This call was a tip-off that Robert Napper likely had weapons, including a gun in his bedsit. His property was raided on the 27th of October 1992, and police recovered a pistol, 244 rounds of ammunition, 2 hunting knives, a crossbow, and 6 crossbow bolts. They also found maps with markings on, the locations of his attacks. A notebook was also found, detailing various attacks and methods of restraining women. There were no names, just vague descriptions, but next to one of these women, he'd written, quote, "sodden filthy bitch." In one of the A to Z's was a fitness card for a young blonde woman. It was placed in the page corresponding to her home address. It's clear that Napper had stalked her. So you have a man, a loner, with an obsession with weapons, who lives in an area on the Green Chain Walk, with notes indicating that he'd stalked and attacked women. Alarm bells should have been ringing. However, Napper was arrested and sent to court solely on weapons charges. He was assessed by a mental health professional who said that Napper was a dangerous man who posed an immediate threat to the public. Despite this, he was simply jailed for 12 weeks and no further inquiries were made. In April 1993, a gun was found buried on Winds Common, southeast London. The weapon was found to have Napper's fingerprints on it, but no action was taken. In July 1993, Robert Napper was spotted acting strangely close to the Green Chain Walk. He was apparently watching women and potentially following them. He was released after having a brief conversation with an officer who wrote in his notebook that Napper, quote, should be considered a possible rapist. He doesn't look like anything was done with this note. I've literally lost track of the number of missed opportunities I've outlined so far. So, as well as murdering Rachel Nickell, Napper continued to subject women to horrific sexual attacks, attacking at least one woman a month. However, he wished to kill again. In November 1993, he would kill 2 people, killing a child, in the most horrific fashion. This part of the video is disturbing and includes graphic descriptions of the murder of a woman and a child, so please skip to the next chapter if you'd rather not hear this. So in 1993, Samantha Passett was 27 years old and the mother of a 4-year-old daughter called Jasmine, with them living together in a flat in Heathfield Terrace in Chiswick in southwest London. Samantha didn't have curtains in her flat, so anyone could look in, and unfortunately, one of these people was Robert Napper. It's clear they'd been watching her for some time, learning her routine, working out the days and times when her boyfriend Conrad would come round. On the morning of the 3rd of November 1993, Robert Napper knocked on the door of Samantha's flat. It seems she opened the door willingly, and as soon as there was an opening, Napper took it. He forced his way in and immediately began a frenzied attack against Samantha in the hallway. She was stabbed around 20 times in the head and the neck, with the blows being delivered with considerable force, including one that cut her spine. With Samantha either dead or dying, Napper went to Jasmine's room, raped her, and then suffocated her. He left her with her toys arranged around her body. Napper then returned to Samantha. He then spent hours mutilating her body. He cut her body open from the chest down to her navel, and then pulled her ribs apart, began stabbing her internal organs before removing them with his hands. He also peeled her skin off in some areas and cut away chunks of flesh, which he left scattered around the room. He He also cut open the top of Samantha's right thigh and attempted to remove the right leg at the knee, but could not cut through the bone. Robert Napper cut away a part of Samantha's abdomen and took it away with him as a trophy. He then posed on a cushion before leaving. In total, Samantha had been stabbed more than 70 times. Samantha's boyfriend Conrad let himself into the flat the next day and was confronted with a scene of absolute carnage. He later described what he saw, quote, "The first thing I saw was a stain on the carpet, which turned out to be Sam's blood. I couldn't tell, so I thought Jasmine had knocked paint over. I went to the kitchen to find something to clean this up with. I found the floor was covered in Sam's clothes. I thought there had been a burglary. I walked into the front room and saw Sam. It was a pile of clothes and blankets with her arms and legs sticking out. It took me a while to realise what had happened. I was in shock. I went to phone the police and suddenly thought, what about Jasmine? I looked in the bedroom. I could see she was in bed with the duvet pulled over her. I just stood outside and chain smoked until the police arrived. I couldn't really understand it all. I don't know how you're supposed to react to something like that. Whether Conrad ever got over the loss of Samantha, or Jasmine, a child he said he loved as though she was his own, or what he saw that day, is unclear. The police attended, and the horror of the scene caused significant psychological distress to those who were forced to see it. An experienced crime scene photographer had to take 2 years off work because of what he had seen. An investigation was started immediately. Dr. Britton, it's that name again, was consulted about whether he believed that these murders were linked to the killing of Rachel Nicole the year before. Dr. Britton ruled out this possibility. Police got a break when a fingerprint was found in the flat belonging to Robert Napper, and he was finally arrested on the 17th of May 1994. Footprints from shoes he owned were also found at the murder scene. A DNA sample was taken, and this identified him as the Green Chain rapist. On the 9th of October 1995, Robert Napper appeared at the Old Bailey in London, where he pleaded guilty to the manslaughters of Samantha and Jasmine Bassett, as well as 2 attempted rapes and 1 rape linked to the attacks on the Green Chain Walk. The manslaughter pleas were on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Essentially, Napper committed the double murders, but he should not be held fully criminally liable for doing this because his mental functions were diminished or impaired because of his underlying mental illness. Napper was assessed by a psychiatrist and found to be a paranoid schizophrenic who also suffered from Asperger's syndrome. I'll go into a bit more detail about Napper's mental health later, but it was concluded that his illness was such that it was deemed to be a significant factor as to why he committed the offences, so his plea was accepted. It was clear that Robert Napper was too dangerous to ever be in society again, and so he was confined to hospital indefinitely. Indefinitely, in this case, inevitably meant for the rest of his life, and he was sent to Broadmoor High Security Hospital. In 2001, a new investigative team re-examined the murder of Rachel Nicole, and, due to advances in DNA testing, they were able to find DNA on evidence found at the scene, which had been in storage for 9 years. The DNA belonged to Robert Napper. He was interviewed at Broadmoor Hospital, but he denied any involvement in her death. However, this made little difference. All of the pieces of the puzzle, which had been missed for so many years, were all brought together, and, on the 4th of December 2007, Robert Napper, the right man this time, was charged with the murder of Rachel Nicole. On the 18th of December 2008, Robert Napper was again at the Old Bailey in London, where, 16 years after her death, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nicole on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Robert Napper was again assessed and was found to be a man with extremely distorted attitudes and beliefs. He believed he had a master's degree in maths, had won the Nobel Peace Prize, had been given medals for bravery whilst fighting in Angola, and had millions of pounds stashed away in a secret bank account. He also had beliefs that he was justified in slaughtering and raping women. Doing this contributed to his overall delusions of grandeur, that he was better than everyone else. He was a sexual sadist, meaning the pain of others gave him sexual arousal and gratification. Unfortunately, the police's failure to catch Napper had led him to feel, quote, powerful and almost untouchable, reinforcing his disturbed perception that he was entitled to do these things. The outcome was exactly the same as before. Robert Napper was sent back to Broadmoor to continue spending the rest of his life in confinement. But this time, at least Rachel's family knew who had killed her, and that he would never darken the streets again. From what I've read, Napper is despised in Broadmoor, where he remains to this day, now aged 57. He has, for years, bragged about his crimes and demanded recognition for what he sees as his accomplishments. I'm not going to say much more here, as I've already gone over the aspects of Napper's mental health, which was relayed in court. He was, by any definition, an extremely dangerous man, not only because of the nature of the offences, but also his level of planning. He was meticulous in his preparation for his crimes, attacking women literally within moments of them being in a secluded area of large public parks, because he'd scouted out these areas days, weeks, months, or even years before the attacks. It's terrifying to think of these women, in fact any man, woman or child, going about their day completely unaware they're being watched by a sick, sadistic predator. Robert Napper's delusions of grandeur enabled him to see his victims as ants, hence he could control and destroy at will, with him taking sadistic pleasure in watching their pain. He spent a significant amount of time eviscerating and posing Samantha Bessette's body. This was no doubt to cause as much horror to those who saw it as possible, which was the effect it had, understandably. I think it's terrible that inaction of the police fed into Napper's illness. He was literally raping women on a monthly basis, had slaughtered women in a public park, had been caught with guns, knives and crossbows, had confessed to being a rapist, and nothing had happened. This must have led Napper to feel like he was some sort of god and that he would never be caught. The police inaction was pivotal to the crimes of Robert Napper. It gave him the confidence to continue and escalate his behaviour. If he hadn't been caught, I've no doubt he would have kept on killing. Peter Tobin was a Scottish serial killer, rapist, paedophile, and sadistic domestic abuser who murdered a minimum of 3 young women between 1991 and 2006, but it's likely he killed many more and began killing earlier than is currently known. A psychopath, Tobin showed no remorse or empathy for anyone, and despite clear evidence of his guilt, never admitted his crimes and refused to give closure to the families of any of his victims. This was a man who had no redeeming qualities and was simply evil. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Peter Brisson Tobin was born on the 27th of August 1946 in the town of Johnston in the west central lowlands of Scotland. The second of 8 children, Tobin began to show delinquent behaviour from a young age, with him being described as, quote, wild by one of his brothers. He showed early signs of having no regard for the welfare of others or following the rules, and was violent from a young age. By the age of 7, he was sent to a reform school which, as the name suggests, was the type of environment where these children received an education and attempts were made to reform them. In the early 1960s, Peter Tobin apparently spent time in Borstal for minor offences. As stated in a previous video, Borstals were a type of youth detention centre in the United Kingdom, which existed between the early 1900s and the 1980s, and were often horrific environments, characterised by abuse both from staff and between the boys. However, in the case of Tobin, I imagine he was the abuser and used this environment to victimise others and indulge his sadistic tendencies. In August 1969, 22-year-old Tobin married 17-year-old Margaret Mountney after a brief relationship when they met at a club they both used to go to called the Barrowlands. Margaret was drawn to the suave and sophisticated man that Tobin projected, and he would treat her with days out and introduced her to his parents. However, this all changed when they moved into a flat together in East Glasgow. Behind closed doors, Tobin's mask evaporated, and he subjected Margaret to horrific abuse. The marriage only lasted a year, but in this time, she was repeatedly beaten and locked in the flat by her husband. Margaret was also raped at knife point by Tobin on several occasions. The most horrific incident that Margaret was subjected to began with Tobin showing annoyance about the barking of their pet puppy named Boot, which he'd bought her. Margaret later said in an interview in 2008 that she discovered Boot missing one day and went looking for him. She recounts, quote, I ran down to the yard and I said, where's Boot? And one guy said, his head's over there and his body's over there. Tobin had decapitated the puppy, apparently in order to, quote, shut it up. And, when Margaret complained, Tobin brutally beat her and then raped her whilst holding a serrated knife to her throat. He then inserted the knife inside her, causing horrific internal injuries. Blood from this axe seeped through the floor and through the ceiling of the downstairs tenants, who called the police, and Margaret was taken to hospital. She spent weeks in hospital, but was too terrified of Tobin to make a complaint to the police. Tragically, the extent of her injuries was such that Tobin had robbed her of the chance of ever having children. Margaret was finally able to flee the marriage when, in 1970, Tobin was sentenced to 5 years in prison for forgery and burglary, and I've little doubt if he had not been removed from her life, she would have been murdered. Tobin served half his sentence and was released in late 1972 or early 1973, and within weeks he'd met and married a 30-year-old nurse called Sylvia Jeffries in Brighton, where he relocated to. In an interview in 2008, Sylvia outlined the horrors she endured at the hands of Tobin. Like his first wife, Sylvia was drawn in by the intelligent, well-spoken man that Tobin pretended to be. But once they married, he believed that he owned her and could do whatever he wanted. The pair had a pet dog, and Tobin would abuse this animal, assaulting it and swinging it around by its collar. Sylvia would also be beaten, and she remembered being threatened by Tobin whilst he was holding a knife to her neck, shouting, quote, "I'm going to kill you." Tobin would strangle Sylvia during sex, and use of violence seemed to be the only way he could become aroused. The pair had a son and a daughter who unfortunately died during infancy, but it was clear that Tobin had no regard for his children, and Sylvia recalls Tobin being annoyed by the rocking of their son's crib, and her, due to pure terror, going over to the baby and saying, quote, please be quiet, you'll make him crosser." Sylvia knew she had to escape the marriage, and in 1976, after 3 years of hell, she was able to do so with the help of a women's refuge. She stated, quote, "I just literally got to carry a bag with some stuff for my child and a pushchair. That's all we had. I can't explain the fear that I had. If he'd have come back, he would have killed me." Sylvia was then helped to get a permanent restraining order, prohibiting Tobin from ever contacting her or their son ever again. Peter Tobin then appears to disappear for almost 10 years, with police being unable to find any real trace of his movements during this time, with them believing that he joined a motorcycle club called the Rising Sun, living a nomadic lifestyle across the country. However, there's potentially another reason for this, as Peter Tobin was a man who frequently changed names and vehicles in order to remain anonymous and move without detection. Tobin is believed to have used over 40 aliases throughout his life, stayed in over 20 different locations, used 40 different phone numbers, and used over 150 vehicles to travel from place to place and cover his tracks. Tobin next reappeared in 1984 when he was living in Portsmouth, Hampshire, during which time an 8-year-old girl reported that she'd been raped repeatedly by him over a number of months. The police were called, but Tobin was not prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. In 1986, Peter Tobin met 16-year-old Kathy Wilson in Brighton, and within 3 weeks, she was living with him. By this point, Tobin was 40 years old, so double Kathy's age, and it's clear that he was targeting younger women, likely for 2 reasons. As I mentioned in a previous video, I believe this was to more easily be able to control his partners due to the difference in age causing an obvious power disparity in the relationship. However, secondly, I believe it's indicative of his sexual attraction to children and young women who would become his future victims. Soon after meeting Kathy, she gave birth to her son Daniel, and in August 1989, they married and moved to a house in Robertson Avenue in the town of Bathgate, West Lothian, Scotland. Within this house, Kathy was subjected to horrific abuse. In an interview in 2022, Kathy said, quote, "Throwing his dinner at me, putting his hands around my throat became routine. I was his slave. Even when I went into labour, he refused to take me to hospital until I'd cooked a roast dinner for him and some friends. I was scared to cross him and felt completely tied." Kathy also stated that Tobin would call her a, quote, "useless bitch," or, quote, "slut." He used her to live out his depraved rape fantasies and regularly bring home prostitutes and forced Kathy to watch him assault, hit, gag, and strangle these women. Tobin would specifically pick emaciated small women akin to children, again demonstrating his paedophilic inclination. Tobin would also threaten to murder their son. Kathy too knew she had to leave, or she would die, as she began to hide money, and in April 1990, she'd saved enough money to flee across the border into England with Daniel, eventually moving to Portsmouth inevitably saving her life. After this, Peter Tobin began committing the murders that had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Peter Tobin's first confirmed victim was 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton, who was last seen on the 10th of February 1991 at a bus stop in Bathgate in Scotland, waiting to return home to her family. This bus stop was less than a mile away from where Tobin was living at the time. What happened next will never be known with certainty, but the most likely scenario is that Tobin pulled up beside Vicky and offered her a lift, and when she was in the vehicle, he drove her to his property in Robertson Avenue, forced her inside, and then attacked and killed her. Her remains were not found for almost 2 decades, so her cause of death could not be determined, but it appeared she'd been beaten, raped, and strangled to death. Tobin then hid Vicky's body, likely in an upstairs bedroom, and when he found a new property to move to in Margate, Kent, he cut Vicky's body in half and wrapped the pieces in curtain and bin bags. On the 21st of March 1991, he drove the almost 500 miles to his new property with her remains in the car. His new address, 50 Irvine Drive, would be central to his exposure as a serial killer decades later. Soon after moving in, Tobin was seen by a neighbour digging a hole in the garden, who he told he was creating a sandpit for his son. A few days later, the neighbour saw the hole had been filled in, not realising that he was looking at the resting place of Vicky Hamilton. Just 6 months after killing Vicky Hamilton, Peter Tobin claimed his second victim, 18-year-old Dinah McNichol, an 18-year-old sixth form student from Tillingham, Essex, who was last seen alive on the 5th of August 1991. On this date, she was hitchhiking home with her boyfriend, David Karslake, from a music festival in Litchcote, Hampshire. Dinah was at the music festival as part of a summer of relaxation before taking the next step in her life. She was described as an intelligent woman, as she had recently passed 4 A-levels, but she would never know her results. Eventually, the pair were picked up by Tobin, and at junction 8 of the N25, near Reigate in Surrey, David was dropped off. He asked Dinah whether she wanted to come back to his house, but she said she just wanted to get home, so she stayed in the vehicle with Tobin, and the car drove away. She was never seen alive again. Again, Dinah's remains were not discovered for almost 2 decades, and it became apparent that she'd been drugged, gagged and bound, with her hands being found tied behind her back. She was then raped and likely strangled to death. It's unclear where Dinah was murdered, but Tobin took her body back to 50 Irvine Drive, wrapped it in bin bags, and then buried it in the garden, mere feet away from the remains of Vicky Hamilton. In 1993, Peter Tobin again relocated, this time moving to Havant in Hampshire, apparently to be close to his son Daniel, who, as I stated, had moved to Portsmouth with his mother, Kathy Wilson, who fled their marriage in 1990. Whilst Kathy wanted nothing to do with Tobin, she wanted her son to have an opportunity to know his father, and so he would sometimes stay with him. However, as if to epitomise the absolute lack of regard for anyone but himself, on August the 4th, 1993, Tobin used his son to lure 2 14-year-old girls into his flat under the guise of giving them a babysitting job. Once in the flat, Tobin threatened them with a knife, bound them, forced them to take drugs which made them drowsy, and then raped both children, including one anally. He also stabbed one of the girls. This was all whilst his son Daniel, who was around 3 or 4 years old at the time, was in the property, but in a separate room. Daniel then walked in and interrupted, at which point Tobin turned on the gas in the property and took his son, giving him back to his mother, and then disappeared. By some miracle, after 5 hours of sitting on a property full of gas, one of the girls managed to loosen her bindings and escape to notify the police. A manhunt was started for Peter Tobin, who was by now going by the name Peter Wilson, and he sought solace in a religious community called the Jesus Fellowship. However, the crime and a photograph of Tobin were featured on the BBC programme Crime Watch, a show similar to America's Most Wanted in the States. The community contacted the police, and Tobin was arrested. On the 18th of May 1994, at Winchester Crown Court, Tobin admitted his guilt to raping and abusing the 2 girls and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. The authorities believed they were locking up a dangerous sex offender. Little did they know they had apprehended a man who had killed at least 2 young women and would continue to kill as soon as he was re-released. Peter Tobin was released in 2004 at age 58 and returned to Scotland, moving to the town of Paisley, close to the town where he was born. Due to the nature of his conviction, Tobin was required to check in with the police regularly, but he soon disappeared, and in November 2005, an arrest warrant was issued when he moved out of Paisley without notifying police. However, Tobin used his skills to evade capture, and, going by the name Pat McLaughlin, he actually did not go far, moving to Glasgow, approximately 12 miles away. By September 2006, Peter Tobin was working as a church handyman at St Patrick's Church in Anderston, in the centre of Glasgow, and it was here that he met his last victim. Angelika Kluk was a Polish national, and just 23 years old when she died. She was working at the church as a cleaner in order to finance her Scandinavian studies at university. She was last seen alive in the company of Peter Tobin on the 24th of September 2006. Angelika was a conscientious, polite, and reliable person, and when she did not arrive for work, the police were called. An extensive search was conducted, and on the 29th of September 2006, 5 days after last being seen alive, Angelika's body was found concealed in an underground chamber beneath the floor near the confessional in the church under a tarpaulin. Angelika had been raped, viciously beaten, and stabbed 16 times, and her hands were found bound behind her back. It's believed that Angelika was still alive, although likely only for a short time, when her body was placed under the floorboards, where she bled to death. Fingerprints found at the scene showed that Pat McLaughlin was in fact Peter Tobin, who by this point had escaped to London, and the nationwide manhunt was begun. On the 1st of October 2006, Tobin went to a hospital in London due to an issue with his heart and gave a false name, hoping this would throw anyone off his tracks. It did not work. He was recognised as being a wanted man from police alerts, and he was finally arrested. Peter Tobin gave no information to the police and appears to have been as obstructive and obnoxious as possible when dealing with authority figures. However, in the case of Angelika Kluk, the police did not need anything from him. They had overwhelming forensic evidence, and he was charged with her murder within 6 days of his arrest. Tobin pleaded not guilty to murdering and raping Angelika, but was convicted of both charges at the High Court in Edinburgh after a 6-week trial that ran between 23rd of March and the 4th of May 2007. Judge Lord Menzies described Tobin as, quote, an evil man, and stated, quote, any case of rape is serious, any case of murder is serious, but what you did to Angelika Kluk was inhuman. He then sentenced him. For the rape and murder of Angelika Kluk, Peter Tobin was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term for 21 years before he could apply for parole. With Peter Tobin safely behind bars, the police coordinated across areas, leading to Operation Anagram being established in 2006. The purpose of this task force was to trace Tobin's movements throughout his life in order to link him to unsolved murders or eliminate him from inquiries. It's like the police, in conjunction with psychologists and psychiatrists, realised how dangerous Tobin was and that he had likely killed other women, but I think their concerns were galvanised when, in prison, he claimed to have killed 48 people. There was no evidence this is true, but it likely reinforced the police that they had no idea how many people Peter Tobin had actually killed. Their inquiries led them to search his former property in Robertson Avenue in the town of Bathgate. Within this property, the police found DNA evidence showing that Vicky Hamilton had been there. Police then searched 50 Irvine Drive in Margate and, acting on intelligence, began to dig up the garden. Finally, on the 14th of November 2007, police recovered the remains of Vicky Hamilton, and 2 days later, on the 16th of November 2007, the body of Dinah McNichol was found. enabling both women to be given a decent burial almost 20 years after they'd been murdered. Peter Tobin was tried separately for the murders of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol. In both cases, Tobin, despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt, including his DNA being found on the wrappings on both bodies, pleaded not guilty and forced the offences to go to trial. With regards to Vicky, on the 2nd of December 2008, Tobin was found guilty of murder after trial at the High Court in Dundee. The judge stated, quote, "You stand convicted of the truly evil abduction and murder of a vulnerable young girl in 1991, and thereafter of attempting to defeat the ends of justice in various ways over an extended period. Yet again, you have shown yourself to be unfit to live in a decent society. It's hard for me to convey the loathing and revulsion that ordinary people will feel for what you have done. I fixed the minimum period which you must spend in custody at 30 years. Had it been open to me, I would have made that period run consecutive to the 21-year custodial period that you're already serving." By the time of this sentence, Peter Tobin was in his 60s, so a new sentence of a minimum of 30 years was essentially confirming that he would die in prison. But this was guaranteed after the conclusion of the trial for the murder of Dinah McNichol before Mr. Justice Calvert Smith at Chelmsford Crown Court. On the 16th of December 2009, after only 15 minutes deliberation, the jury found Tobin guilty of murder. Justice Calvert Smith then sentenced him, stating, quote, "The mandatory life sentence in this case has to be accompanied by a whole life order. Therefore, this confirmed that Peter Tobin would spend the rest of his life behind bars." Peter Tobin was sent to HMP Edinburgh and received some retribution for his crimes, including on the 1st of July 2015 when he was tapped with a razor blade whilst he was asleep, which resulted in a 20cm long scar running down his face and neck. By October 2022, Peter Tobin was in ill health, suffering from cancer, and was transferred to the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. I wouldn't normally post a picture of someone so vulnerable in the hospital, but here is an image of Tobin, chained to the bed, alone, dying. The police made one final plea to Tobin to reveal the details of other murders he committed, but he remained silent. And on the 8th of October 2022, at the age of 76, Peter Tobin died in hospital. No one came forward to claim his body, so he was cremated and his ashes scattered at sea. The police investigated Tobin's potential connection to in excess of 15 unsolved murders and disappearances of young women and children across the UK, Ireland and Scotland. Some of these offences appear unlikely to have been committed by Tobin, but there are at least two that seem likely. The first of these is the disappearance of 18-year-old Louise Kay, who disappeared on the 24th of June 1988, when, after a night out with friends, she said that she was going to sleep in her car at Beachy Head in Eastbourne, in East Sussex. This was something that she'd done before. However, Louise then disappeared, and her body and a hand-painted gold Ford Fiesta car have never been recovered. Peter Tobin was known to be working in Eastbourne at the time of the disappearance, and apparently was trying to sell a hand-painted car. It appears that researchers, police officers, and psychologists believe that Peter Tobin was likely responsible for the disappearance and likely murder of Louise Kay, with them believing that he buried her body somewhere known only to him. The second case was that of the murder of 22-year-old Jessie Earle, who vanished, again in Eastbourne, sometime between the 15th and the 18th of May 1980. Her skeletonized remains were found in 1989 as she'd been bound with her own bra. Again, Tobin is believed to have been living and working a short distance away from where Jessie disappeared. Unfortunately, no firm evidence has ever been recovered to definitively identify Peter Tobin as the murderer of any other young girls or children, and, given his death, he's inevitably taken his secrets to the grave with him. Before speaking about Peter Tobin, I want to play a very short clip for you. I'll explain why in a moment. The reason why I added this clip was because I'm always fascinated what these people look like when they're actually committing their offences. I sometimes find it difficult to reconcile the outwardly calm person who appears in court and the monster their poor victims must have experienced in their last moments alive. However, sometimes they let the mask slip. Ted Bundy did this on at least one occasion, and I believe that this is Peter Tobin doing the same. You get a flash of just a fraction of the true monster that he was, a devil in human form. With regards to him, I've read that Tobin was a psychopath, but I cannot see when he was diagnosed or whether this is even a formal diagnosis. However, I've no doubt it's true. He clearly had no remorse for any of his actions, and behind his suave and confident demeanour was a spider just waiting to draw women into his web, and when he caught them, he subjected them to horrific acts of violence, rape, and eventually murder. At the core of Tobin's behaviour, aside from no empathy for others and remorse for his behaviour, I think of two things. Firstly, a hatred of women, and secondly, sadistic sexual interests. I think the best example of this is actually his behaviour towards his partners. As I've stated in previous videos, the most common profile of domestic abuse perpetrators are those who seek to control in order to ensure they're not abandoned. However, Peter Tobin is different, and, in my opinion, represents the most dangerous type of domestic abuser, which, given how insidious and often fatal it is really saying something. What I mean by this is that it's clear that Tobin was a nomad. He seemed quite content to move around the country, uprooting his life frequently, and, from what I can see, had no real social connection or friends. So this indicates that Tobin abusing his partners was not about trying to stop a partner from leaving him. He didn't care about this. I think it was just about torturing women. The abuse that he subjects his partners to, I can only conclude came from a deep hatred of females. But where this came from and why, I can't say. It's clear that the violence used by Tobin sexually excited him, with one of his wives indicating this was the only way he could get aroused. So I have no doubt that raping women was his fixation, with their terror and cries likely heightening his sense of gratification. This man was a monster, an inhuman specimen who took so much and gave nothing during his miserable existence. I have no doubt that Peter Tobin killed far more people than we will ever know, as I find it inconceivable that a man with his proclivity to violence would suddenly start killing at the age of 44 and kill 2 women within 6 months of each other, having never done this before. I doubt, as Tobin claimed, he killed over 40 people. I think this was just a narcissistic boast from a pathetic little man, but I wouldn't be surprised if the true number, although we'll never know, is above 10. This case is truly sickening, and I'm sure you'll agree that this man, Jordan Monaghan, is pure evil. The reason for this is that Monaghan is a British serial killer who ended the lives of 2 of his 3 children between 2013 and 2016. One of them was just 28 days old. Monaghan also unsuccessfully tried to do the same to his 3rd child on 2 occasions. Whilst under investigation for these offences, Monaghan began a relationship with a woman, Evie Adams, who he abused and eventually killed in 2019 by poisoning her. All the while, Monaghan never showed any remorse for his crimes and continued to live his life as normal until it was finally revealed to be the monster that he was. Welcome to Evil Among Us. There's little information about Jordan Monaghan's early life, but it appears he was born in 1991, either in or around the town of Blackburn in the county of Lancashire, UK, approximately 20 miles northwest of Manchester. While still a teenager, Monaghan began a relationship with a girl of the same age, called Laura Gray, and in November 2008, so when he was around 17 years old, Monaghan and Laura became engaged. Almost exactly 3 years later, on November the 17th, 2011, the pair welcomed their first child into the world, Logan, a happy and healthy baby boy. However, there were already issues in the relationship due to Monaghan's chronic gambling addiction, with him racking up thousands of pounds of debt on multiple credit cards and blowing all of his wages as soon as he received them. This meant the family were in significant financial difficulty, bills were unpaid, and they were in dire straits. On the 23rd of September 2012, the situation came to a head, and Laura, by now pregnant with the pair's second child, told Monaghan the relationship was over. After having this conversation, Laura went on a shopping trip and then received a call from Monaghan saying that Logan had been rushed to hospital due to a suspected paracetamol overdose due to him finding Logan playing next to a pack which had some tablets missing. Laura, beside herself with worry, rushed to the hospital to be at Logan's bedside. However, when she got to the hospital, it transpired that no drugs were found in Logan's system. It had been a false alarm. Laura felt that Monaghan had just been overly cautious due to his love for their son, and this incident and his response appeared to pave over the cracks in the relationship temporarily. However, this incident was the beginning of a sick and twisted game played by Monaghan, using his own children like chess pieces in order to manipulate Laura into staying with him, but also, I believe, punishing her for daring to suggest ending the relationship. The pair welcomed their second child, Ruby, on December the 8th, 2012. Laura later said that the family had the, quote, best Christmas ever after Ruby was born, and, quote, I felt like the luckiest mum in the world with my own little family. It was all I'd ever wanted. I was determined to give my children everything I never had. However, tensions continue within the relationship, with Monaghan continuing to gamble, blowing all the money he earned, whilst racking up debts and contributing nothing to the household. This led to Laura again threatening to end the relationship, and it seems that Monaghan felt he needed to escalate his behaviour, to create a situation where Laura would be so utterly devastated that her focus would be redirected and she would forget about ending the relationship and would ultimately look to him for support. So he decided to murder the children. On the 28th of December 2012, Ruby, aged 20 days old, was taken to hospital due to difficulty breathing. She was diagnosed as suffering from bronchitis and stayed in hospital until the 31st of December 2012, when she was allowed home. Literally, just a few hours later, in the early hours of January the 1st, 2013, Laura was woken up by Monaghan, who said that Ruby had stopped breathing. Laura stated, quote, I ran downstairs and I could see, the moment I looked at her, that she was gone. Laura was unfortunately correct. An ambulance was called, but there was nothing that could be done. And so, baby Ruby, aged just 28 days old, was pronounced dead at 2:45 a.m. The cause of death was determined to have been due to bronchitis. However, the truth is that Monaghan had smothered Ruby in her Moses basket whilst Laura was asleep. Monaghan had clearly ensured that she was dead before waking Laura, meaning that his pathetic and disgusting pantomime of performing CPR on his daughter was just a performance likely to make him seem like a father desperately trying to save his daughter's life rather than the one who had taken it. Laura fell to pieces after the death of her daughter and relied heavily on Monaghan to get through this grief, with him taking care of the funeral arrangements and generally being her rock. Of course, the focus became on trying to come to terms with the death of their daughter, and the issues in the relationship seemed to evaporate. Laura later stated, quote, he just carried on, but again, I just thought that he was being strong for me. I didn't suspect a thing. We focused on Logan because he was all we had left. Jordan had a really close relationship with his son. However, again, the same pattern re-emerged, and Monaghan continued to gamble, resulting in tensions in the relationship. On the 16th of August 2013, Laura again had had enough of Monaghan and told him the relationship was over. The next day, the 17th of August 2013, Monaghan said he wanted to take their son Logan, now aged 21 months, swimming. Monaghan took Logan to Waves Water Fun Centre in Blackburn, but neither of them actually went swimming. In the changing rooms, Monaghan suffocated Logan. Then, in an act of ultimate depravity, he secured his son's dead body into his buggy, covered it with a rain cover, and wheeled it home. claimed that Logan was asleep and that Laura should wake him up before he went out to get pizza. Laura said that as soon as she lifted the rain cover, she knew Logan was dead. She called Monaghan in a frantic state, and he rushed home and again made a show of performing CPR on the child he had murdered. However, Logan was beyond saving and was pronounced dead. His cause of death was determined to be inconclusive. Laura was so distraught that she had to be admitted to a psychiatric facility. However, Monaghan came to visit her every day, and she leaned on him exclusively to try and get through a parent's worst nightmare. The support led them to rekindle their relationship, and again, all his financial recklessness was forgotten. Sickeningly, after the death of Logan, Monaghan gave at least one interview to the press in which he stated, quote, "It's been like a bad dream, and we expect to wake up at any moment. You never get over losing a child, but we were just starting to move on and then Logan dies. You always expect your children to outlive you, and don't think you'll have to plan their funeral. But we had to do it twice in 8 months. It's heartbreaking." He also complained that police were treating him and Laura like criminals. The couple's third child, a daughter, was born in May 2016. It appears that this child, who cannot be named for legal reasons, was again harmed by Monaghan, but thankfully survived despite his best efforts. Specifically, at the girl's christening on the 18th of September 2016, Laura caught Monaghan using a fruit machine, and this led to an argument where she said she would leave him. On the 27th of September 2016, Monaghan was alone with his daughter when he shouted to Laura that she'd stop breathing. An ambulance was called, but the child appeared to recover on their own. On the 2nd of October 2016, their daughter again suffered another apparent respiratory episode whilst alone with Monaghan. She spent 9 days recovering, but no cause for her sudden illness was found in the hospital. Later, it was proven that Monaghan had suffocated his daughter on each of these occasions, attempting to murder her. After this last incident, the relationship between Laura and Monaghan broke down permanently, and I've read alternatively that Laura was given full custody of their third child, but also read that they were taken into care. Either way, Monaghan had no access to his daughter, inevitably saving her life. The deaths of 2 children and the serious illness of another within the same household led to serious concerns amongst professionals, but it was not until January 2018, almost 5 years after the children's deaths, that investigations between the police and medical professionals determined the most likely cause of these incidents was deliberate obstruction of the children's airways. It was then not until April the 13th, 2018, that Jordan Monaghan was arrested on suspicion of murder and attempted murder. This clip shows past the interview, specifically related to the death of Logan.
You're under arrest, obviously, on suspicion of the attempt murder of Logan. That's for an instance on the 27th of the 7th, 2013. That's attempt murder on the 17th of the 8th, 2013. Okay?
Yeah.
It sounds it was before. You're responsible for either of those 2 offences?
No.
But he was away when you left Wales?
It was, no. Not when I left.
He wasn't awake? When did he fall asleep?
Just as we was coming out of Wales.
The police didn't have enough evidence to charge Monaghan, and he was released on bail. However, it appears they kept a close eye on him. This included reaching out to women that he tried to start relationships with, informing them that he was a dangerous man. Unfortunately, this did not stop Monaghan from forming a relationship with a woman called Evie Adams in early 2018, when she was just 22 years old. Evie Adams did not have the best start in life, being removed from an abusive household with her brother when she was young, with both children being the victims of violence and neglect. When she was around 7 years old, the fostering agency called Yvonne Adams and asked if she and her husband Bernard would take the children, to which they agreed, and the pair never left, being loved by Bernard and Yvonne as if they were their own children, and 3 years after first arriving, they were both adopted. At the age of 16 years old, Evie took their surname, cementing her place as their daughter. Around the same time, Evie moved out and began a relationship with her first serious boyfriend, Nathan. And when Evie was around 19 years old, she became pregnant with her first child, a daughter. Unfortunately, she suffered postnatal depression after the birth, and this put a strain on her relationship with Nathan, and they separated, but they would co-parent their daughter, with her spending certain days with her father at his property. However, it appears that Evie was lonely and didn't wish to raise her daughter alone, and she began looking online for a new partner. In early 2018, Evie and Jordan Monaghan met through Tinder and began a relationship. Monaghan sought to control and isolate Evie almost immediately, telling her not to inform people that the pair were together, with her family only finding out because they heard local gossip about the fact he'd been seen at her house. Her parents and friends were concerned, as Monaghan was believed, within the local community, correctly, to be a child murderer, and they begged Evie to end the relationship, but tragically, she dismissed their concerns. Monaghan started to sever connections that Evie had with support, including her friends and also her former partner Nathan, with him threatening to burn down his house if he carried on contacting Evie, and that he didn't care if the pair's daughter was in the property when this happened. However, Evie quickly fell under his spell, taken in by Monaghan's charm, being made to feel special and no longer alone. Monaghan subtly chipped away at Evie's self-esteem, reminding her that she'd been abused as a child and therefore somehow damaged, and that she would not be able to find anyone else if they were not together. The police and social services entered the scene almost immediately, with the police warning Evie the danger she and her daughter were in, as well as taking her to a place of safety. Social services basically gave Evie a choice of being with Monaghan or having her daughter removed from her care, and she initially appeared to agree to stop seeing him, and a restraining order was imposed in May 2018, prohibiting Monaghan from having contact with Evie. However, Monaghan ignored this order, and the pair kept having contact, leading to him breaching the order repeatedly, including in June 2018, December 2018, and March 2019. He appeared in front of the courts for each of these breaches, and eventually went to prison for 12 weeks after the last breach. However, it's clear that he had no intention of relinquishing control over Evie. Due to the continued contact between the pair, in early 2019, Evie lost custody of her daughter, with the child being removed due to concerns that Monaghan would harm or kill them. Evie was devastated, and while she still had regular supervised contact with her daughter, it clearly wasn't the same. By mid-2019, it appears Evie was looking for a way out of the relationship with Monaghan and wanted to make changes so that she could have her daughter returned to her care. With the help of services, Evie was able to gain a place in a women's refuge in Kendal, approximately 50 miles away. The locations of women's refuges are closely guarded secrets for obvious reasons, as these women are often escaping from men who, if they could track them down, would likely kill them. However, Monaghan found Evie's location quickly, likely due to tracking her phone, and she contacts a friend telling her that Monaghan was following her around everywhere she went. She was advised to call the police, but she didn't want to get Monaghan into further trouble. However, despite all attempts, Monaghan would find a way to continue to slither his way back into Evie's life. By October 2019, the pair were back in a relationship, but it appears that Evie was fighting back, showing defiance of Monaghan's control, which led to more frequent arguments. The tipping point appears to have come over the weekend of the 11th to the 13th of October 2019, when Monaghan, Evie and some friends went to stay in a caravan in Blackpool. Monaghan didn't hide the person he was. He was rude, aggressive, intimidating, and eventually smashed up the caravan they were all staying in. When they returned back to Blackburn on the 14th of October 2019, Evie appears to have told Monaghan that the relationship was over, as she began to look for a new place to live, away from him. However, Monaghan had no intention of allowing this to happen, and, on the same day, he joined a WhatsApp group titled, quote, UK Tablets, and sent a message to buy drugs saying, quote, who's got tramadol, and asking others for, quote, pregabs and blues, meaning diazepam and pregabalin. Tramadol is a strong painkiller, whilst diazepam and pregabalin are medications used for a variety of conditions, but when taken with tramadol can cause drowsiness, sedation, and slow breathing and heart rate, potentially resulting in death. Within days, Evie's flat hunting had been placed on hold as she was reportedly being extremely unwell. It appears that Monaghan was poisoning Evie, giving her high doses of a combination of these drugs, which has a severe and rapid impact on her body. By October the 22nd, 2019, Evie was delirious and suffering from abdominal pains. Her body was shutting down. Her breathing was also getting slower, along with her heart rate. In one of the last messages Evie sent to Monaghan on the 23rd of October 2019, she stated, quote, "I feel like I'm dying." Unfortunately, she was correct, and her life was ebbing away, and it's horrific to think how scared she must have been, going from active and healthy to dying within the space of approximately 2 weeks and not knowing the reason why. On the 24th of October 2019, Evie Adams had extremely high levels of sedative in her system, was in significant pain, and was unable to walk. Monaghan then administered a fatal dose of tramadol, intended to kill her. He gave her a dosage equivalent to 20 50-milligram tramadol tablets. This dosage is approximately 3 times the amount that a doctor would usually ever prescribe for this powerful painkiller, and this, combined with the residual sedatives in her body, resulted in an overdose and her death at the age of just 23 years old. Whether Monaghan stood and watched Evie die is unclear, but it's apparent that he was taking steps to cover his tracks immediately. After administering this fatal dosage to Evie, he took her phone and went to work. He then sent himself a message from her phone, which read, quote, "I've taken the drugs. I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want help," clearly laying the groundwork to make her death look like a suicide. As with other people like Monaghan, they appear to have real difficulty in understanding how people would actually react in this situation. Because they lack normal human emotions, they act in a strange way, which actually raises suspicion. In the case of Monaghan, instead of dropping everything and running home to be with his partner, who had just texted him saying she was going to kill herself, he finished his working day and texted her aunt, asking her to check up on Evie. Evie's aunt Julie went round there and found her niece dead in bed. Given the fact that a young woman had died suddenly, the police were called and began an investigation. But, whilst they were suspicious, they could not be sure Evie's death was suspicious. It was actually Monaghan's own arrogance and stupidity which raised concerns and led police to take a closer look at him. Specifically, a few weeks after her death, in November 2019, Monaghan told police that he'd found a suicide note. This was apparently hidden in a picture frame, which he'd found when he took the photo out to apparently place in Evie's coffin. This was considered very odd, as the note, which as a suicide note was clearly intended to be read, was put in a place where it could potentially have never been found, and it was just by chance that Monaghan had happened to open that one picture frame. Also, the handwriting did not match Evie's. An autopsy established that Evie's death was due to a fatal overdose, and Monaghan was interviewed on suspicion of killing her in both October 2019 and June 2020. He denied having anything to do with her death. Unfortunately, again, the police didn't have enough evidence to charge him, and so he was released on bail. Monaghan pretended to be the grieving boyfriend, including posting this disgusting post on Facebook. So, by 2020, Jordan Monaghan was on bail, whilst the police investigated his potential involvement in the murders of 3 people. So, what did Monaghan do? He went back to his old lifestyle of gambling and drinking, and this disgusting clip from around October 2020, so a year after Evie's death, shows him apparently having the time of his life, filming himself singing along to the song Mr. Brightside by The Killers. Due to that being a copyrighted song, I can't play the sound, but you're not missing much. breakthrough in this case came in late 2020 when the police were able to obtain Monaghan's phone, and this showed him buying the very drugs that Evie had overdosed on just before she started to become unwell. On the 17th of January 2021, the walls finally closed in on Monaghan, and he was arrested on suspicion of murdering Logan, Ruby, and Evie Adams, as well as 2 counts of attempting to murder his third child. He continued to deny any involvement, and when confronted with the new evidence about the search on his phone of him trying to source drugs, he said they were for him. He was not believed, and on the 18th of January 2021, Monaghan was charged with all offences and remanded into custody to await his day in court. Jordan Monaghan pleaded not guilty to all offences and went to trial at Preston Crown Court. This trial lasted 10 weeks, and on December the 17th, 2021, the jury found him guilty of murdering Logan and Ruby by suffocating them and Evie Adams by administering a fatal dosage of medication. He was also found guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder against his third child with Laura Gray by suffocating them. Later that same day, Monaghan stood before Mr. Justice Goose for sentencing. Justice Goose stated, quote, "It's difficult to imagine why you carried out these offences, but having listened to the evidence in this trial, I'm sure that you are an exceptionally controlling, selfish, and cruel man." He then sentenced him. For 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, Jordan Monaghan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 40 years. On the 29th of July 2022, this was increased to a minimum of 48 years when the Court of Appeal deemed the original sentence to be too lenient. Based on this, Monaghan will be around 77 years old before he's able to apply for parole, assuming he lives that long. Concerns have been raised to the media about the handling of this case by several different agencies, including medical professionals, and their lack of, quote, professional curiosity regarding the deaths of both Logan and Ruby, with their deaths not being treated as suspicious. I've also read about a serious case review being initiated at Blackburn Council, inevitably around safeguarding, and why the family was not scrutinised more closely when the children have repeated contact with medical professionals, and why consideration wasn't given to removing the children from the home. In addition, criticism has been levelled at the speed of the police investigation, with Monaghan not being charged with the murders of his own children until 8 years later, and 3 years after a review had established that his 2 children had likely been murdered by suffocation. In response, Detective Chief Superintendent Pauline Stables stated, quote, "The deaths of both Ruby and Logan were subject to review in 2018. We gathered all the information the previous investigation filed. It's really difficult. You've got a loss of evidence from previous investigations because the deaths were treated or deemed to be natural causes. You've got medical evidence that's lost, CCTV, so it's really difficult to investigate historical crimes. Loss of evidence related to the suspicious death of 2 children. I'm not sure about you, but I find this explanation absolutely staggering. The glacial progression in this case and the lack of action by agencies meant that Jordan Monaghan was free to murder another person, a vulnerable woman whose death has devastated her family and left a daughter without a mother. Monaghan should have been safely behind bars a lot sooner, and lives would have been saved. Serious case reviews should result in a report, which can be accessed by the public. I cannot find any. Potentially they are pending, and I'll likely do an update on this video if I can get hold of them, as they often contain a lot more information, including background regarding the offender. However, even without this information, I for one am struggling to understand how a man this dangerous was allowed to walk around free for so long, free to kill again. This is one of the most horrific cases I've covered, and in order to highlight why, we need to look at why Jordan Monaghan committed these crimes. It should be pointed out that Monaghan did not admit his culpability, and the trial established his guilt, but not his motivation, so this is just my analysis. but I'm very confident I'm on the mark. So, going back to the profile of domestic abusers, these individuals often have backgrounds of trauma themselves, which results in them having low self-esteem and issues with abandonment, and they're unable to cope with the end of a relationship and or being on their own, and so they look to control their partners, eroding their self-esteem and placing them in a position, often through fear, where they feel unable to leave. Control is obtained and maintained through a variety of tactics, including violence, threats of violence, emotional abuse, isolating behaviour, etc. If they feel their control is being defied, for example, if their victim tries to leave the relationship, they will implement whatever tactics to stop this, as well as punish them for daring to consider that they have any say in the coupling. So, that is the basic template, which I found is common amongst domestic abusers. But in the case of Monaghan, there are additional factors I think need to be considered, in particular indicators of narcissism and psychopathy. Specifically, I think that Monaghan is a man who is entirely self-centered. No one else matters but him and what he wants, and, in this case, remaining in a relationship. With regards to psychopathy, I think it's obvious that he has no empathy, no compassion for others, and is willing to harm anyone, even his own children, without any regret or remorse. So, together, you have a man who is emotionally dependent on relationships and is willing to do whatever it takes in order to remain in control in these situations, even if it involves harming and killing others to get his own way. This would explain why, whenever Laura Gray tried to end the relationship, he would not have this, as I looked for some way to ensure this would not occur. He figured that the best way to do this was to create some sort of emergency which would completely redirect Laura's attention away from concerns about his behaviour, and he decided on using the one thing most precious to her, but clearly of absolutely no consequence to him, their children. So he created situations where she was in a blind panic when the children were sick, and he would then ride on his white Charger, pretending to be supportive and caring, being her rock. However, he needed situations which would utterly devastate Laura, destroy her psychologically, make her look to him entirely for support, and give him further opportunities to act as the hero. In order to achieve this, he killed the children, knowing that this would cripple Laura and make her forget any intention to leave him, and give him opportunities to act as the hero, including CPR on children he knew to be already dead, and organising a funeral, etc. So, rather than taking steps to address the main issue which seemed to be causing issues in the relationship, his gambling, he thought it was a better idea to kill his own children. The absolute evil of this man is so profound, and I cannot get my head around how he could kill his own children, likely by placing his hand over their nose and mouth, watching and feeling their life ebbing away, abusing the ultimate trust that is placed in a parent by a child, and destroying the most precious gift that a person can receive in their life. These children were just pawns in his sick little game. He was no father. He's not even worthy of being referred to as a human being, in my opinion. I think there was also a form of punishment in his actions. It's sickening that he wheeled Logan home knowing he was dead, and they got Laura to lift the rain cover and see her son like that. I have no doubt Monaghan was filled with glee, knowing the impact this would have on her, and he was likely thinking to himself, so you think you can leave me? This is what happens when you try. Eventually, he formed a relationship with Evie Adams, a woman who had a history of trauma herself, who was struggling as a single mother, and who just wanted to be loved and supported. No doubt, Monaghan presented himself as her saviour, and manipulated her into believing that he was the answer to all of her problems. The one positive in this case, and I use that term loosely, is that Evie's daughter was removed from her care, and this is only because I have no doubt that Monaghan would have harmed or killed this child eventually. However, in the absence of anyone else, he targeted Evie directly, and, when she wanted to end the relationship, he poisoned her. Initially, I think this was to incapacitate her, making her so ill that she was entirely under his control. Why he eventually killed her is unclear, but I think that Monaghan knew he could not let her recover, that if she did, she would tell the police who was giving her the pills, and it would only be a matter of time before he was arrested. She was an inconvenience and needed to be eliminated. Why Evie took the pills is also a question that remains unanswered, But I think it's important to note that during the Blackpool trip in October 2019, one of her friends noticed Monaghan giving her tablets out of a bottle. I think it's likely that Monaghan had already got Evie hooked on medication as a form of control, and so she'd be more likely to continue taking pills he gave her, potentially due to already being addicted to them. I want to say something in this case to try and offset some potential negative comments. People may say, why did Laura or Evie not know what was going on? Or why did they not take better care of their children, etc.? I really want to stress that unless you have been in this type of situation or seen it up close, it's difficult to put into words how insidious domestic abuse is, how these men are often skilled manipulators who can change people and make them act in ways that, looking back, they may be completely disgusted by. Even if you think both women potentially should or could have acted differently, I don't think that anything that either of them did meant that one should lose their life at the age of 23 years old and the other one had to spend the rest of her life mourning her 2 children. Nothing they did or didn't do meant they deserved that. So, please be respectful of these women. Do not lose focus that this monster, Jordan Monaghan, is the ultimate cause of this. May he rot in prison and then, hopefully in the depths of hell. On another note, I want to highlight support services if you need to talk to someone about domestic abuse. In the UK, a great place to start for advice and help, especially with escaping an abusive relationship, is to call the National Domestic Abuse Helpline 24 hours a day on 0808 2000 24/7. Also, Women's Aid is an amazing organisation that offers advice and practical support, and they can be found at www.womensaid.org.uk. The website has lots of information, as well as a live chat function, which is active between 8 AM and 6 PM Monday to Friday, and 10 AM to 6 PM at the weekend. There's an option you can click on the website, which quickly takes you to a Google home screen if you need to hide what you're doing from your abuser. In the US, call the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence on 1-800-799-SAFE or visit www.thehotline.org. The advantage of this website is that if you double-click escape, it takes you to a Google homepage, which will mean you can hide what you're doing if you're disturbed by your abuser. The link to both websites will be in the description. However, if you or someone you know is in immediate danger, then do not hesitate to call 999 or 911 or whatever the emergency service number is in your country. Sidney Cook is a British convicted rapist and suspected serial killer, currently serving a life sentence for horrific crimes against children in the 1970s. However, these offences are just the tip of the iceberg. Cook was a prolific predator who abused children from the 1960s until the 1980s, and was the head of a group of paedophiles known in the press as the Dirty Dozen. These men abducted, raped, and killed male children. Cook is one of the most remorseless, depraved, and disgusting offenders in UK criminal history, who, at the age of 95, is also one of the oldest serving prisoners in Britain. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Sidney Charles Cook was born on the 18th of April 1927 in Stroud in the county of Gloucestershire. Little is known about Cook's childhood, but he later claimed in court that he was sexually abused as a child. This may have been his way of trying to gain sympathy from the judge and portray himself as a victim, or it may indeed be true, but it's no excuse for anything that he did as an adult. In August 1945, Cook joined the British Army, but was a terrible soldier, and he was frequently AWOL and served several prison sentences for this. He was eventually kicked out of the army in 1952, spending most of his time either on the run or behind bars, rather than serving king and country. In the early 1960s, Cook found work as a fairground worker, which would enable him to travel around the country, interact with children, and eventually target them without suspicion. Cook specifically manned a test your strength machine, which was popular with young boys keen to show off. When Cook began sexually abusing children is unclear, but in 1961, he was given a £20 fine for molesting a boy in a cinema. Cook's next confirmed victims were 2 brothers, with the youngest being 10 and the elder one being around 11 or 12. They both came from an abusive household, where there were 9 children in total, with their father being described as an alcoholic, violent bully, and their mother being unable to care for the children. Cook came across the family whilst working at a fairground in 1970, and it appears that this family may also have been from this community, as the offences he committed were across various areas, indicating this family moved around frequently. The youngest boy was abused by Cook for approximately 5 years from the age of 13 years old, being anally raped, as well as being forced to perform oral sex on Cook, whilst also having him engage in this behaviour on him. The older brother was molested at the same time as his sibling for around 4 years and threatened with violence if he didn't comply. On some occasions, the boys would be taken together to an allotment and sexually assaulted by Cook and a friend of his. Remember these offences, as they'll be important later. How many children Cook molested during the 1970s is unclear, as he targeted disadvantaged families and children from backgrounds of abuse where he could easily integrate himself, molest the children, and then, when the fairground moved on, simply up sticks and set up in another area. Cook, like other serial offenders, was able to take advantage of this nomadic lifestyle and is known to have moved around England, both north and south, going between Oxfordshire, London, Kent, Hertfordshire and Tyne and Wear. It appears that Cook would frequently offend with his associates, who also had a sexual attraction to boys, and, as time progressed, the number of people linked to this behaviour increased, to the point where there were around 12 paedophiles who would engage in these offences, and they became known as the Dirty Dozen. Sometimes there are more than 12, sometimes less, but there appears to have been a core of dedicated and prolific paedophiles led by Sidney Cook, which included the following monsters. Leslie Bailey, known as Catweasel, due to his staring eyes which resembled the title character of the British children's TV series of the same name, was born on the 21st of June 1953 in Hackney in London. He had below average intelligence and spent the majority of his childhood in care. In 1973, Bailey sexually assaulted and attempted to murder a 7-year-old girl. For some reason, the charges were reduced and he spent just 5 months in a mental hospital. In 1979, Bailey followed a woman into a lift in a block of flats, beat her and anally raped her. He was sent to prison for 5 years for this attack, being released in around 1982. Robert Oliver was born in around 1955. His mother apparently hated the fact that she had a son, and so dressed him up in women's clothing. By the age of 14 years old, Oliver would spend most of his time at arcades, where he'd be taken advantage of by men who would give him money for sex. Lenny Smith was born in Wales on the 23rd of August 1954. He too spent much of his childhood in care and was known to be the victim of sexual violence, but also the instigator of this type of behaviour. He was the victim due to his time working as a male prostitute in London, but he would also pimp out other young men and children. Smith met Robert Oliver in around 1973, however it's not clear when he met Sidney Cook. In 1977, Smith was sent to prison for a year for gross indecency with a child. Aside from the link between Lenny Smith and Robert Oliver, it's difficult to establish when and how these 4 men met each other. However, regardless of how they met, between around the late 1970s and the 1980s, these men would take the lead in travelling around the country, abducting young boys off the street or hiring child prostitutes, at which point they'd be drugged, held whilst other paedophiles were gathered, and then gang raped. Due to the lack of DNA evidence back in the 1970s and the early 80s, the nomadic behaviour of these men, and the vulnerability of their victims, the number of children abused by this paedophile ring has never been established. Similarly, we don't know how many children these men murdered. Conservatively, it's believed they gang raped upwards of 50 children, although this is likely to be a significant underestimation. With regards to children they murdered, this figure varies wildly depending on sources, but could be anywhere from 7 to 20. The deaths of only 3 children ever led to any charges against these men, with Cook, the leader of the group, only being convicted of offences related to one of them. On the 1st of June 1984, 7-year-old Mark Tilsley met a man on the street where he lived in Wokingham in Berkshire, who took him to a sweet shop and bought him a bag of sweets. This man was Sidney Cook, and the shopkeeper heard Cook saying that he would pay for Mark to go on the dodgems that night. Cook was working at a local fairground, having set up his test of strength machine there. After finishing his dinner at 5:30, Mark left his home and rode his bike to the fairground. Before he left, his mother told him to be home no later than 7:30, and he said to her, quote, "Don't worry, Mum, I won't be late." These were his last words to her. It appears that by this point, Cook had already set his plan into motion, with him calling Leslie Bailey, and he and Lenny Smith travelled from London to Wokingham to attend a, quote, party that evening. When they got to the fun fair, they met Cook, who had lured Mark away from the main site on the promise of buying him sweets. It appears that Mark was becoming scared, and he resisted, and he had to be picked up and forced into the car and driven to Cook's caravan a short distance away. They then met with another paedophile, known only as Oddbod, at the caravan. Once inside, Mark was given a glass of milk laced with muscle relaxant before being raped by all four men. More muscle relaxant was poured down his throat, and he was gang raped again. At some point, it was noticed that Mark was dead, but Cook said he was just unconscious and returned him to the site of the abduction. The other men left, leaving Cook alone with Mark's dead body. Cook then disposed of Mark's remains, likely burying it somewhere known only to him, and, to the present day, he's never revealed where this poor child's remains are. When Mark didn't return home at 7:30, an extensive search was started, but no trace of Mark could be found. Unfortunately, it appears that he was already dead by this point, so before his parents even knew he was missing. Mark's father John passed away in 2005, and his mother Lavinia in 2011, with both parents dying before they could lay their boys to rest. On the 15th of September 1985, 6-year-old Barry Lewis was outside playing with his friends when he left and began to walk the short distance to his home in Walworth, in South London. He never made it home. Barry was abducted by force or lured into a vehicle. It's important to point out at this point that by the early 1980s, the paedophile group led by Cook had attained a flat, although I've read somewhere there might have been two, in the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, East London. The flat I found information about was described as squalid and disgusting, and, whilst people did live there, the main purpose was to have a place where children could be drugged and gang-raped. The lead tenant at the property and the main person who lived there was Lenny Smith. Sidney Cook was living a short distance away in another flat in Hackney. All through the early 1980s, there were sexual attacks on children in the area, likely all committed by members of this group. It's to this address that Barry was likely taken after being abducted. Here he was drugged, stripped, and anally raped by 7 or 8 men, including Sidney Cook, Robert Oliver, Leslie Bailey, and likely Lenny Smith. Barry was left covered in blood by this ordeal and was believed to have been dead. He remained in the flat until the next day, when Bailey was tasked with disposing of the boy's body. As he was driving towards the county of Essex, northeast of London, Barry stirred, and it was clear that he was still alive. Bailey then strangled Barry, and, when he was sure he was dead, dumped his body in a field in Essex, approximately 30 miles from the site of his original abduction. His body was not found until the 5th of December 1985, almost 3 months after his abduction. Jason Swift had an extremely difficult life. He was born in March 1971 in Warwickshire, in the Midlands, as one of 5 siblings. The family lived in poverty, and, due to the level of neglect in the household, Jason and his siblings were taken into care. Jason's short life was characterised by moving from place to place, from care home to care home. He also had learning difficulties, meaning he needed to attend a special school. He was described as being both quiet and withdrawn. Jason was once asked by a psychologist if he had 3 wishes, what would he ask for? He stated, quote, money, a house, and food. By late 1985, aged just 14, Jason was in London and had, for some time, been travelling around the city, going to public toilets where men would take advantage of him and pay him money or give him food in exchange for sexual services. He's also thought to have been a regular visitor to the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, and evidence was later revealed that he appears to have known Lenny Smith and was seen going in and out of his flat dozens of times in the months prior to his murder. The exact date of Jason's death is unknown, but it's believed that he was murdered on the 27th of November 1985. It's also not clear how he ended up in the flat on the Kingsmead estate, whether he was there willingly or had been abducted and taken there. However, what is known is that Sidney Cook had arranged for at least 6, but likely many more men, to pay him £5 to anally rape Jason. This included Cook himself, but also Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and inevitably Lenny Smith. Jason was drugged and raped for hours, and at some point during this ordeal he died, likely by being suffocated, with something being placed over his nose and mouth deliberately. Jason's body was then taken and dumped in a copse near a place called Stapleford Tawney in Essex, approximately 20 miles away from the site of his murder, where it was discovered on the 30th of November 1985 by a farm worker. Although he was killed after Barry Lewis, Jason's body was recovered 5 days beforehand, and the deposition sites were around 10 miles apart. Autopsies on the bodies of both Jason Swift and Barry Lewis show police that both had sustained horrific injuries from being raped by multiple men, showing them not after one man, but a group of men. Also, it was clear around the same time, in the same area, men were offering their services as babysitters in order to gain access to children to rape, and this included Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and Lenny Smith. In January 1986, the police therefore began a task force investigating the offence of this paedophile ring. Over the course of 1986 and 1987, the police interviewed thousands of witnesses and people of interest and compiled thousands of pages of evidence and intelligence. As time progressed, each of the main group members was arrested. Initially, they were detained for various sex offences, and this included Sidney Cook and Lenny Smith, who were both arrested in February 1986, related to the sexual assault of a 13-year-old boy. Whilst in prison on remand for this offence, Cook would boast about raping children and the murder of Jason Swift. He would go into graphic detail about raping and killing boys, with him saying that he killed many of them. The prisoners were so disgusted that they contacted the police to tell them what they'd learned. In June 1987, Robert Oliver was arrested and charged with abusing children whilst posing as a babysitter. Oliver was questioned about the death of Jason Swift and confessed that he knew him through Cook and Smith, therefore forming the link between them. In July 1987, Leslie Bailey was arrested and soon confessed to being present on the day that Jason died, raping him and being complicit in his death. He named all of the men that were present. This same month, Sidney Cook was confronted with all the evidence whilst in prison, and he admitted raping Jason, but claimed that he'd simply been invited to a, quote, gangbang, organised by someone else, and he was not responsible for his death. He said that Lenny Smith had brought Jason to the property originally. By 1988, enough evidence had been obtained to charge all 4 men with raping and murdering Jason Swift. Unfortunately, by the time of the trial in 1989, charges against Lenny Smith had been dropped due to lack of evidence. It's really unclear why this happened, as there were multiple witnesses who saw Jason going in and out of his property in the months before he died. Bailey and Cook had also admitted he was there and involved, and Cook even said he was the one who brought Jason to the property. As if this wasn't worse enough, after long, quote, legal arguments, the charge of murder was dropped and replaced by one of manslaughter, so acknowledging that Jason had died during the sexual assault on him, but this was not deliberate, and that he'd been suffocated accidentally during this abuse. The men were convicted on this basis. On the 12th of May 1989, the men were sentenced. Sidney Cook was sentenced to 19 years in prison. Leslie Bailey was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Robert Oliver was also sentenced to 15 years in prison. The police continued to investigate the abduction, rape and murder of children. In 1990, Leslie Bailey confessed to police that he'd raped and murdered Barry Lewis, and that he'd raped Mark Tilsley, and was therefore involved in the incident which had led to his death. He gave detailed confessions about who was involved in these crimes, as well as outlining multiple other offences committed by the group. He stated there were at least 8 burial sites dotted around the south of England where victims were buried, but was vague with the details, and none of these sites were located. It appears that in May 1991, the police began a series of 64 interviews with Sidney Cook whilst he was in prison. During these interactions, he apparently went into minute detail about raping Barry Lewis, clearly taking great glee in reliving the experience. However, despite Leslie Bailey's confession and Cook's admission, no one else was charged with these murders, which seems absolutely ridiculous to me. What led to this decision was the fact that Leslie Bailey had significant underlying cognitive and emotional issues, and this, coupled with the fact that he was a child rapist, meant he was not considered a credible witness. In addition to this, Cook subsequently withdrew his confession to raping Barry, and there was little other evidence, so there was not enough to charge anyone else with the offences related to Mark and Barry. So Bailey stood alone in the dock when on the 14th of June 1991, he pleaded guilty to murdering and raping Barry Lewis, and on the 22nd of October 1992, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter and rape of Mark Tildesley. Leslie Bailey was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, but I don't have any information about how long he was meant to serve before he could apply for parole. However, it doesn't matter, as Bailey would never see freedom again, and his time in prison was short. On October the 7th, 1993, he was found dead in his cell at H&P Whitemoor, a Category A prison in Cambridgeshire. He'd been murdered, strangled to death by 2 inmates as retribution for his crimes. Before turning to what has become of Sidney Cook, I want to look at the fates of the other men involved in this case. It's clear that Lenny Smith essentially escaped justice for his part in the murders of children. However, he did not ride off into the sunset. A prolific and dangerous sex offender, he was eventually sent to prison for 10 years in 1992 for a string of horrific sex offences against a 6-year-old boy he was babysitting. He was released from prison in June 1999, but requested to be placed in a secure housing block for offenders next to Nottingham Prison. It appears this was a housing block where serious offenders would go to before moving on to another property, but Smith never left there. It seems that the crimes of the Dirty Dozen had been well publicised by this point, and the community was in uproar about any of these men ever seeing freedom again. Smith likely knew that if he stepped out into the real world, he would be murdered. This was a well-founded concern, given that Leslie Bailey had already been murdered, but also a man named Bill Malcolm was murdered in February 2000. He was living in a property in East London when someone knocked on the door. When he opened it, he was shot at point-blank range in the head. Malcolm was an associate of the Dirty Dozen, but I'm unsure exactly what offences he was involved in with them. However, his record is described as appalling in and of itself, and it included him raping a 6-year-old girl. Then, when he was released from prison, tracking her down and raping her again, while saying, quote, "You put me away, you bitch." It's believed this was an organised hit by gangs who felt he deserved to die for his crimes. No one mourned his passing. So Lenny Smith, likely fearing he would suffer the same fate, lived in this property attached to the prison, apparently leaving only once or twice for 7 years until his death from AIDS in 2006. Robert Oliver served his original sentence and was released, apparently changing his name. Due to his crimes, he was required to register as a sex offender and have restrictions about having contact with children, i.e. he shouldn't have any at all ever. In July 2013, he was jailed for 3 years for breaching these conditions, as he'd apparently gone into a household with children and sent a birthday card to a 1-year-old. He was released in 2014 and is apparently still alive, but probably with a new name. So what became of Sidney Cook? Sickeningly, his sentence of 19 years was reduced by the Court of Appeal to 16 years in 1992, as he was able to argue that, due to Leslie Bailey's confessions, he must have been the leader of the group. He was just following. Why this made a difference, I do not know. However, the police knew that he was the ringleader. This meant that Cook would be released in 1998. During his time in prison, Cook showed no remorse and refused to undertake any rehabilitation programs. In fact, he revelled in his offending and was seen as a celebrity by other paedophiles. He would describe in graphic detail how he'd raped and murdered children, claiming he killed between 15 and 20. The public was well aware of how dangerous Cook was, and so, when he was released on the 6th of April 1998, they were waiting for him. Despite changing his name to Sidney Lomas, Cook was easily recognisable, and it was clear that if someone got their hands on him, they would tear him limb from limb. Cook was housed at Yeovil Police Station in Somerset for his own protection and stayed there for 9 months, not leaving the premises. The police knew they had an extremely dangerous child rapist and murderer now released. It was only a matter of time until he began offending. They needed something, anything, to hang on him, to get him off the streets forever. Luckily, they got a break. They were able to obtain statements from the 2 brothers I mentioned at the beginning of the video, who Cook abused for years in the 1970s. Based on this, on the 20th of April 1999, just over a year after his release, Sidney Cook was charged with 18 sexual offences against these children, including rape and sexual assault. During his police interview, he admitted the offences, and showing his disgusting, distorted thinking, he told the officers that the reason why he'd performed oral sex on one of the boys, after he'd forced this child to do this to him, was because, quote, he gave me entertainment, and I returned the compliment. Sidney Cook was remanded into custody after being arrested, and on the 17th of December 1999, he appeared at Wolverhampton Crown Court before Judge David Poole for sentencing, having pleaded guilty to the offences for which he was charged. Judge Poole stated, quote, "The reports before me are unanimous, that notwithstanding your advancing years, you remain for the time being, and will remain for an incalculable period, a serious danger to children." He then sentenced him. Sidney Cook was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 5 years before he could apply for parole. Sidney Cook has been eligible to apply for parole from around 2004, and at the time of recording, this has been refused 10 times, most recently in October 2021. He was back in the papers again in October 2022, when a story appeared about him making an appeal to get his freedom. Obviously, a story like this produces panic, and I sometimes wonder whether the authors are just ignorant of how things work, or know and just want to be sensationalist. Basically, prisoners on life sentences can apply for parole at regular intervals. This is reviewed by the parole board. This happens maybe once a year or once every 2 years. The parole board can decide to release them back into the world, move them to open conditions, which is a less restrictive environment, or refuse either of these 2 things. Cook has been denied either release or a move to open prisons since he first became eligible for parole and remains in the Monster Mansion, H&P Wakefield, a cash VA prison which houses some of the country's most dangerous offenders. The fact he still remains in this environment and has not been moved to a lower security prison for his entire time in custody shows what the authorities think of him. Sidney Cook can apply for release until the cows come home, but he'll never be released. And, at the age of 95, he's hopefully coming to the end of his miserable life, and the next headline will be about his death. Sidney Cook is one of the most prolific and remorseless child sex offenders and murderers the UK has ever seen, and that is just what we know. Unfortunately, Cook committed his offences at a time when there were no CCTV cameras, and our understanding of DNA was still in its infancy. He was a calculating and predatory sex offender, travelling the length and breadth of the country abusing children. I've no doubt that he specifically chose working at a fairground, knowing this would attract little boys who he could then abuse before packing up and moving on to a new site quickly without anyone batting an eyelid. His type of victim was not arbitrary either. Cook targeted children he knew had fallen through the cracks in society, like Jason Swift, a lost young man who was already being abused by predatory men when all he wanted was a roof over his head and food in his belly. Sidney Cook is a man who devoted his whole life to the abuse of children. He was inevitably a sexual psychopath. I've no doubt that he got sexual gratification from hearing the screams of his victims. He also saw that he could make money from this, and so got men to pay him to rape the children he obtained. The men whom he committed these offences with were no less evil. All of them were deeply disturbed, horrific excuses for human beings. Together, these men and all of the others involved formed an unholy alliance intent on meeting their disgusting sexual need to abuse young boys, destroying their bodies, and for those they did not kill, inflicting wounds so deep psychologically and emotionally that I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people they abused and let live committed suicide afterwards or struggled with being able to cope in their life until this very day. People who victimize children are cowards, pure and simple, but Cook existed in a world surrounded by pathetic cowards and gained a sense of celebrity from these pathetic sycophants. All through his time in prison, it appears he wanted recognition and praise for the things he had done. I've read that Cook is a remorseless and arrogant man, and imagine that if you sat down with him, he would sit there with a smirk on his face, just asking for a kicking. The most heartbreaking part of this story is just how little we know about the crimes of Cook and the so-called Dirty Dozen. Several men I haven't mentioned were convicted of their part in this paedophile ring, but the majority were never identified and never prosecuted. This lack of knowledge also means the identities of all the children they murdered will never be known. Each one of these victims represents a life that was snatched away before it even begun, but also a family who never knew what happened to their loved one, or, even worse, because of the type of children he targeted, some may never have been reported missing. Their disappearances may not have even been noticed. I hope that all of the children who died at the hands of Sidney Cook and his disgusting band of paedophiles are at peace, and the ones that survived have been able to rebuild their lives despite what these monsters did to them.